There is a place in northern Ontario where the bedrock does something it is not supposed to do. You can find it if you know where to look, and very few people do. Down a logging road that has not been properly maintained since the late 1980s, past a creek that runs black with tannins in the autumn, up a low ridge where the spruce trees grow close together and the light goes thin and green between them, the ground opens. Not dramatically, not with any of the fanfare you might expect from a discovery, just a cleft in the Canadian Shield, dark at the bottom, smelling of cold mineral air and something else, something that takes a moment to name, and then you see it. Cut into the stone, descending at a precise and even angle into the earth, are steps. Not rough, natural ledges, not a coincidence of geological layering. Teps, uniform in width, consistent in rise, the edges worn smooth in the way that stone wears when something has passed over it thousands of times across thousands of years. They go down farther than your flashlight reaches. They go down into a darkness that the Canadian Shield has been holding since before anyone thought to ask questions about it. And then they stop being visible, and you are left standing at the top of something you cannot explain in a country that has decided, mostly, not to try. Canada is enormous. If you have ever looked at a map of it, really looked, you understand that it is not so much a country as a geographic fact. A mass of rock and water and forest so vast that the inhabited southern ribbon along the American border is almost a footnote to the wilderness above it. The Canadian Shield alone, that ancient slab of Precambrian rock that underlies most of central and eastern Canada, is one of the oldest exposed geological formations on the surface of the Earth. It is 3 billion years old in places. It has been scraped by glaciers, buried under shallow seas, heaved up by tectonic forces, and carved by rivers for longer than complex life has existed anywhere on this planet. And for most of recorded Canadian history, it has been treated as empty, as a resource deposit, as the thing you pass through on the way somewhere else. Historians who write about Canada tend to begin their accounts somewhere around the arrival of European explorers. The Vikings, briefly, around 1000 CE, the Portuguese perhaps in the 1400s, John Cabot, officially, in 1497, Samuel de Champlain, Pierre Radisson, the Hudson's Bay Company, the coureurs des bois paddling birch-bark canoes into territories that European maps simply labelled with variations of here, a story that begins with contact, with fur, with cod, with conflict between French and English colonial ambitions, and eventually with confederation and railways and the long complicated project of becoming a nation. What this story does not include, except in the most cursory way, is the question of what was here before all of that. And I do not mean the indigenous peoples who met the Europeans at the shore, whose histories are gradually, incompletely, being woven back into the official account. I mean something older than that. I mean the question that a small number of archaeologists, geologists, and indigenous knowledge holders have been asking quietly for decades, sometimes at the cost of their professional reputations. The question of who, or what, built the things that keep turning up beneath the surface of this country. The things that look deliberate, the things that look engineered, the things that look, most specifically in the case, we are going to spend the next several hours exploring, like staircases. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The word staircase sounds so ordinary, so domestic. You walk up a staircase every day, probably. You do not think about what it means to cut a staircase into stone. You do not think about the tools required, the planning, the sustained labor, the reason someone would need to descend regularly and repeatedly into the earth at a given location over a long enough period that steps become the practical solution. A staircase is not a curiosity or an accident. A staircase is infrastructure. It is the physical record of a decision made by a mind to go somewhere specific, often enough that the journey needed to be made easier. And when you find a staircase in a place where no staircase is supposed to exist, cut into stone that has not been touched in a very long time, in a country whose official history insists that the people living here before European contact did not build in stone, did not create permanent underground architecture, did not descend into the bedrock for any purpose that would require steps, you are not looking at a geological curiosity. You are looking at a question that the entire framework of North American archaeology is not well equipped to answer. There are more of these than you might expect. That is the first thing to understand. This is not a story about one anomalous feature in one remote location that might be explained away as a freak of natural fracturing. The staircases beneath Canada and beneath parts of the northern United States that share the same geological foundation have been reported by surveyors, loggers, miners, railroad workers, road construction crews, indigenous elders, and a handful of researchers who took the report seriously enough to look. They have been documented in field notes and then filed away. They have been photographed, and then the photographs have been lost. They have been described in letters that ended careers or simply went unanswered, and they keep turning up, quietly, persistently, in places spread across a geographic range so large that coincidence becomes the most strained of all possible explanations. The accounts go back to the earliest days of European exploration of the Canadian interior, not in the official records, which tend to omit things that do not fit the narrative of a pre-contact wilderness waiting to be discovered and used, but in the personal journals, the private letters, the field notes that were never meant to be published, that sat in archives for a century before anyone thought to look at them with fresh eyes. There is a journal held in a small regional archive in northern Ontario, written by a man named Aldous Hearn. He was a surveyor working for a railway company in the 1880s, part of the vast project of mapping and measuring the Canadian Shield in preparation for the construction of what would eventually become the Transcontinental Railroad. His official reports were meticulous, precise, professionally useful, but his private journal, which his family donated to the archive in 1961, along with a box of other papers that nobody looked at for another 20 years, contains something his official reports do not. On the 14th of August, 1884, somewhere in the country north of what is now Sudbury, Ontario, Hearn, and two Ojibwe guides, he identifies only by their English names, Thomas, and the man he calls Old Peter, came across what he describes as a series of stone steps descending into a fissure in the shield rock. He notes that the steps were regular in a way that natural rock fracturing was not. He notes that Thomas refused to approach them, and that Old Peter walked to the edge of the fissure, looked down, said something in Ojibwe that Hearn could not translate, and then walked away without explanation. Hearn himself descended 3 steps before deciding that the darkness below and the smell coming from it were sufficient reasons to stop. He measured the width of the steps as approximately 22 inches. He estimated the rise at approximately 7 inches per step. He noted that the stone showed wear consistent with long use. And then he wrote, in the careful handwriting of a Victorian professional, that he did not include this feature in his official survey report because he could not think of what category to put it in. That last sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. A trained surveyor, a man whose entire professional purpose was to observe and record features of the landscape, encountered something he could not categorize, not something he doubted. He did not write that he was uncertain whether the steps were natural or constructed. He wrote that he could not think of what category to put them in, because his professional framework had no category for pre-contact stone staircases in the Canadian Shield. The category did not exist, so the thing that needed to go in it was simply left out. This is a pattern. It repeats so consistently across so many different accounts, from so many different sources, across so many different decades, that it eventually stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like a structural feature of how European and Euro-Canadian culture processes information that does not fit its existing frameworks. It is not usually malicious. It is not, in most of these cases, a deliberate decision to suppress or conceal. It is something subtler and in some ways more troubling. It is the quiet, systematic disappearance of anomalous information into the gap between the categories that exist and the things that do not fit them. In 1889, a man named Frederick Coulter wrote to the Geological Survey of Canada from a location he described as northeast of Lake Nipigon in what is now northwestern Ontario. Coulter was not a geologist. He was a logger working for one of the timber companies, then stripping the boreal forest from the edge of the shield. His letter is brief and plainly written, the letter of a man who is not accustomed to writing letters and is doing so because he does not know who else to tell. He describes finding, at the bottom of a drainage gully exposed by spring flooding, a section of bedrock in which steps had been cut. He says there were at least 12 visible steps before the gully filled with water and gravel again, and that they were going down at what he estimated as a 45-degree angle into the rock. He says the steps were evenly spaced, and that the edges of them were sharp in a way that made him think they had not been there as long as everything else in the rock. He asks if the GSC would be interested in examining the site and leaves a rough description of its location. There is no record of any response. There is no record of any follow-up expedition. The letter exists in the GSC archive, not because anyone acted on it, but because it was filed and forgotten, which in some ways is the best thing that could have happened to it. Because filing and forgetting is also a form of preservation. When you read these accounts one by one, it is possible to explain each of them individually. Aldous Hearn was a Victorian surveyor in unfamiliar country who may have been misled by the geology of a region he did not know well. Frederick Coulter was a logger with no scientific training who may have been looking at a natural feature and interpreting it through a human lens. These are reasonable possibilities, but they are not the only possibilities. And when you place these accounts alongside dozens of others spanning a century and a half, alongside the consistent testimony of indigenous peoples whose oral traditions describe the same features in language that was formed long before any European surveyor arrived to offer an alternative explanation, the individual explanations start to feel less like reasoning and more like a reflex. Because the thing about the Canadian Shield is that it is not geologically inclined to produce regular, uniform, repeating ledges that descend at consistent angles into fissures and clefts. The shield fractures. It splits. It erodes into remarkable shapes under the influence of glacial grinding and chemical weathering and freeze-thaw cycles over millions of years. But it does not, as a rule, produce the thing that Hearn measured and Coulter described, and that a dozen other observers from different periods and different backgrounds saw and wrote down in nearly identical terms. Regular rise, regular tread, smooth edges indicating use, descending into darkness. The geological framework for understanding why this matters is worth spending some time on because it is the foundation on which everything else in this story rests, and it is more interesting than it might sound. The Canadian Shield is Precambrian rock, which means it formed before the evolution of complex multicellular life. It is primarily granite and gneiss, rock that cooled from magma deep in the Earth's crust and was then exposed over billions of years by erosion of the overlying material. It is among the hardest rock on the planet, and that hardness is important because working granite and gneiss with stone tools is not impossible. It is difficult. It requires time, specific techniques, specific knowledge of how the rock fractures, but it has been done. We know it has been done because there are examples of it on every inhabited continent. The question, in the Canadian context, is not whether it could be done. The question is, who did it, and when, and why the evidence keeps getting explained away before anyone can properly examine it. There is a conversation that happens, or rather that does not happen, in North American archaeology. It concerns the question of who was here, and what they were doing, and how long ago. The official timeline, the one taught in schools and enshrined in textbooks, goes roughly like this. Humans first entered North America from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge sometime around 13,000 years ago, possibly a bit earlier. These first Americans, known in the archaeological literature as Paleo-Indians, were hunter-gatherers who gradually spread south and east across the continent. Over thousands of years, they developed the regional cultures that eventually became the ancestors of the indigenous peoples encountered by European explorers. None of these cultures built permanent stone architecture in the subarctic and boreal regions of what is now Canada. None of them created underground structures accessed by carved staircases. The Shield was a place people moved through and hunted in and gathered from, not a place people built into. This is the framework, and there are, increasingly, significant problems with it, not problems invented by enthusiasts or conspiracy theorists. Problems documented in peer-reviewed archaeological and genetic literature by researchers at major universities who are willing to say, carefully and with all appropriate hedging, that the story is more complicated than the official timeline suggests. There is Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, where stone tools associated with cut-marked animal bones have been dated to between 24,000 and 27,000 years ago, placing human occupation in North America during the peak of the last glacial maximum, more than 10,000 years before the Clovis first model would allow. There is the genetic evidence, accumulated through analysis of ancient DNA from archaeological sites across the Americas, showing that the indigenous peoples of North America are not descended from a single founding population, but from multiple waves of migration that occurred at different times and by different routes, some of them far earlier than the official timeline acknowledges. There is the site at Monteverde in Chile, where humans were present at least 15,000 years ago and possibly much earlier, a fact that required the people living at Monteverde to have travelled the entire length of 2 continents before the ice-free corridor through which they were supposedly supposed to have entered the continent had even opened. These are not fringe claims. They are documented in Nature, in Science, in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. They are debated fiercely among professionals, and the debate is moving, slowly and with great resistance, in a direction that makes the official timeline look increasingly like a simplification that served certain purposes at certain moments in the history of North American archaeology, and is now becoming harder and harder to maintain. What this means for the question of the staircases is this. If people were in North America earlier than the official timeline acknowledges, and if the genetic evidence suggests that multiple populations with different origins and different cultural traditions arrived at different times, then the question of who might have built permanent underground architecture in the Canadian Shield is not answered by the standard response that no cultures in this region built in stone, because we do not actually know what all the cultures in this region were doing, or how long they were here, or what capabilities they had. Let us go back to the accounts, because they are the centre of this, and there are more of them than I have told you yet. In 1912, a team working for a mining company conducting prospecting surveys in the area north of what is now Timmins, Ontario, came across a feature that their foreman, a man named Douglas Emmett, described in his field report as a constructed descent. The language is important. Emmett did not write that they found steps. He wrote that they found a constructed descent, a phrase that implies he recognized it as deliberate, but was using more cautious language, perhaps because he was writing an official report and was aware of how it would read. The feature, he wrote, consisted of a series of level stone surfaces descending at a consistent angle into a natural cavity in the bedrock. He estimated there were at least 8 such surfaces visible, each approximately 18 inches in depth and 7 to 8 inches in height. He noted that the edges of the surfaces showed a degree of precision that he associated with tool use. And then he noted, crucially, that the cavity into which the descent led showed no accumulation of glacial till, meaning that whatever had been deposited there by the glaciers that covered this region until approximately 10,000 years ago had been removed, or had never been present, suggesting that the descent had been cleared and maintained over a very long period of time. This detail, the absence of glacial till, is one that keeps appearing in the accounts that are specific enough to include it, and it is not a trivial detail. The glaciers that covered the Canadian Shield during the last ice age left a characteristic deposit of material, ground-up rock and sediment and organic debris in every cavity and depression they encountered. When you find a cavity in the shield that does not have this deposit, you are looking at something that was actively maintained, cleared, or used during a period that extends back before or into the time of glaciation, which is a very long time, and which implies a continuity of occupation and activity in a place that the official history of this continent insists was uninhabited, or only very recently, and sparsely visited by nomadic hunter-gatherers who left no permanent mark on the landscape. Douglas Emmett's field report is in the archive of the mining company for which he worked, a company that no longer exists, but whose records were donated to the provincial archives in the 1940s. It has not been published. It has not been cited in any archaeological literature I have been able to find. It exists in that peculiar category of documents that are technically accessible but practically invisible, buried in a collection that has never been fully catalogued and that most researchers would have no reason to know to look in. The pattern of burial is not always accidental. There is a document from 1941 held in the National Archives of Canada that is a memorandum from a regional director of what was then the Dominion Bureau of Statistics to a colleague in a different department. The memorandum concerns a report by a surveyor named Robert Ainsworth, who had been conducting a land classification survey in an area of northern Quebec and had described finding, in his words, stone steps cut into an escarpment along a river drainage, descending to a depth he was unable to determine. The memorandum asks the colleague to advise on how this information should be handled in the context of the official survey report. The colleague's response, also in the file, recommends that the feature be described in the report as a natural geological formation and that Ainsworth's personal account be retained, but not incorporated into the published findings. The reason given is that including such a description without adequate supporting evidence would undermine the credibility of the survey as a whole. This is the clearest example I have found of a deliberate decision to exclude information about anomalous underground features from official records. But it is almost certainly not the only example. It is simply the one where someone wrote the decision down and the document survived. The memo does not read as sinister. The person who wrote it was not trying to conceal a discovery or protect a secret. They were making a pragmatic professional judgment about credibility and institutional reputation, the kind of judgment that gets made 100 times a day in bureaucracies everywhere. But the cumulative effect of 100 such judgments, made over a century and a half, is that the official record contains almost nothing about these features, while the unofficial record, the private journals, the personal letters, the field notes that were never meant to go anywhere, contains quite a lot. Now let me tell you what the Anishinaabe have been saying about these places, because this is where the story changes character entirely. Not because the oral traditions are more reliable than the documentary record, though in some ways they are, but because they describe the same features from a completely different angle, with language and frameworks that developed independently of any European influence, and because the consistency between what the oral traditions describe and what the surveyors and loggers and miners saw when they went underground is not the kind of consistency that comes from coincidence. The Anishinaabe people, whose territory covers a vast arc of the Great Lakes region and the Canadian Shield, have a body of oral tradition that is among the most carefully maintained in North America. Parts of it are ceremonial, transmitted only in specific ritual contexts to people who have been prepared to receive it. Parts of it are more generally shared, stories about the landscape, about the forces that inhabit it, about the relationship between the human world and the worlds below and above it. And woven through this tradition, in multiple forms and multiple registers, is a consistent account of descents into the earth that were made by people who knew the way. The Anishinaabe word that translates most closely as staircase in the relevant oral tradition context is not a word that refers to a constructed feature. It is a word that refers to a process, to the act of going down in a way that implies the existence of a path. Going down in the way that something that knows the way goes down. This distinction is important because it suggests that in the Anishinaabe conceptual framework, the descent into these places was not thought of primarily in terms of the physical structure that made it possible, but in terms of the knowledge required to use it. The staircase was infrastructure, but it was infrastructure that only meant something in the context of knowing where it led and why you were going there. Elder accounts collected by ethnographers working in the Anishinaabe communities of northern Ontario in the early and middle 20th century, accounts that are now held in university archives and in the files of various anthropological organizations, include repeated references to places in the Shield where one could go down into the rock. The descriptions given by different elders from different communities and different decades are remarkably consistent. These are not places one visits casually. They are places with specific purposes, associated with specific kinds of knowledge and specific kinds of practice. Going into them requires preparation. Coming out of them requires ceremony. And the way into them involves a descent that the elders describe as structured, as having a particular form that was made by people who knew what they were doing. One account, collected in 1937 by an ethnographer named Margaret Fallow, whose papers are at the University of Toronto, quotes an elder from a community near Lake Nipigon as saying, in translation, that the old ones went into the earth the way water goes into the ground, finding the path that was already there and following it down. When Fallow pressed for more detail, asking whether the path was made by human hands, the elder said that the distinction between made and found was not one that applied to these places. that the people who made the paths were following something that was already in the rock, that they were finishing what the rock had begun. This is a philosophically sophisticated distinction that deserves more attention than it usually gets in the literature. The elder was not saying that the steps were natural. He was saying that the people who made them were not imposing something foreign on the rock, but completing a process that the rock itself suggested. This is a fundamentally different relationship to stone construction than the European tradition brings to it. In European thinking about architecture, the builder imposes form on material. The material resists. The builder overcomes the resistance. In the framework this elder was describing, the builder reads the material and responds to what is already there. The steps follow the line that the rock would have taken if it could have taken it without human intervention. They are not carved into the rock, they are revealed in it. This framework is not just philosophically interesting. It is technically accurate in a way that might explain some of the features that observers have noted in these staircases. The consistent reports of smoothness at the edges, the wear that implies long use, the precision of the angles, these are characteristics not just of deliberate cutting, but of cutting that follows the natural grain and fracture lines of the rock, cutting that works with, rather than against, the material properties of granite and gneiss. Someone who knew the shield well enough to find where the rock wanted to go and then helped it get there would produce exactly the features that the surveyors and loggers described. The Haudenosaunee oral tradition, which covers the Street, Lawrence and Great Lakes region and extends into what is now upstate New York, contains accounts of underground places that are described in somewhat different terms, but point toward the same geography and the same type of feature. In the Haudenosaunee tradition, there is a concept of places where the world thins, where the boundary between the surface world and the world beneath is less substantial than it is elsewhere. These places are associated with specific kinds of power and specific kinds of danger, and they are accessed through descents that the tradition describes as having been prepared by the ancient ones, the people who came before the people who came before us. The phrase ancient ones, or its equivalent in the Haudenosaunee languages, appears in this context in a way that is distinct from its use in some other oral traditions. It does not refer to ancestors in the genealogical sense. It does not refer to the recent historical past. It refers to a time so far back that it is beyond the reach of the normal genealogical memory that oral traditions maintain. The ancient ones who prepared the descents are not the grandparents of the elders. They are from a time when the world was different, when the things that could be done with stone were different from what has been possible in more recent memory. There is a note in the papers of Lewis Henry Morgan, the 19th century anthropologist who worked extensively with the Haudenosaunee, and whose work, for all its limitations and errors, remains one of the most detailed records of Haudenosaunee oral tradition from the pre-reservation period, in which Morgan records, being told by a Seneca man in 1847, that the places where one goes into the ground are very old, older than the people, and that the people learnt to use them from the ones who were here when the world was being finished. Morgan, characteristically, notes this as a myth about origins and does not pursue it further. But the phrase older than the people is the kind of phrase that rewards examination. It does not mean what a casual reader in the 19th century, steeped in the assumption of indigenous recency in North America, would have taken it to mean. It means something that predates the current cultural group, and depending on how deep the cultural memory of the Haudenosaunee tradition reaches, that could be a very long time. The Cree Nation, whose territory stretches across an enormous arc from northern Quebec through northern Ontario and Manitoba and into what is now Alberta and Saskatchewan, has its own body of oral tradition about underground places, and it differs in emphasis from the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee accounts in ways that are instructive. Where the Anishinaabe tradition tends to frame the underground places in terms of paths and knowledge, and where the Haudenosaunee tradition tends to frame them in terms of power and boundary, the Cree tradition is more explicitly concerned with the question of purpose. What were these places for? The Cree account, as it appears in various forms across different communities and different periods, describes underground places that were used for what translates most closely as keeping. Not storage in the material sense, not places where food or tools were kept, but places where things that needed to be held were held. The distinction is subtle, but it keeps appearing. What was kept in these places was knowledge, or the things that held knowledge, or something for which keeping is the best English approximation, but which the Cree conceptual framework understands differently. The underground places were where things went when they needed to be safe for a long time, when the time above was wrong for them, when what was kept needed to wait. I want to be careful here not to overinterpret or romanticize this material. Oral traditions are not geological survey reports. They encode information in forms that are shaped by cultural frameworks and ceremonial purposes and the needs of the communities that maintain them, not by the desire to provide literal descriptions of physical features. When a Cree elder says that the underground places were for keeping, I am not in a position to say that he is describing a literal archive, a library carved into the bedrock of the Canadian Shield. But I am also not in a position to say that he is not. The language is metaphorically rich in a way that is consistent with metaphors that encode literal information, and the consistency of the keeping theme across multiple Cree communities and multiple time periods suggests that it is describing something real, something that the communities experienced as real, even if the nature of that reality is not fully accessible through the lens of an outsider reading ethnographic notes. What makes the Cree accounts particularly interesting in the context of the staircase reports is a detail that appears in several of them. The keeping places that the Cree tradition describes were accessed by going down in a particular way. The going down was not just a physical act, but a learned one. There was a right way to do it, and the right way involved following a path that had been prepared, that had form, that was not the same as simply climbing down a rock face. The prepared descent is not always described in terms that clearly distinguish it from a natural feature, because in the Cree framework, as in the Anishinaabe framework, the distinction between prepared and natural is not as absolute as it is in the European tradition, but it is there. The keeping places had a way in that was made, not found. The Mi'kmaq oral tradition, which belongs to the Atlantic, coastal and maritime regions of eastern Canada, adds another dimension to this picture. The Mi'kmaq are not a shield people in the same way the Anishinaabe and Cree are. Their territory is the maritime provinces and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a different geological and ecological context. But their oral tradition contains accounts of underground places that share certain features with the shield accounts, and the consistency between them across such different geographic and cultural contexts is one of the things that makes the body of evidence as a whole more rather than less compelling. The Mi'kmaq word that ethnographers have translated variously as cave, underground place, and hidden chamber refers to something more specific in its original context. It refers to places that have been shaped, places that show the marks of being prepared for use, as distinct from natural cavities in the rock which have a different word. This linguistic distinction is important because it means that the Mi'kmaq tradition explicitly recognized a category of underground places that were made or modified by people, as distinct from places that were simply found. And the accounts of these shaped places include descriptions of going down into them that are consistent with descriptions of constructed descents. In one account, collected in 1922 by a researcher named Cyrus McCallum, whose papers are in the archives of Dalhousie University, a Mi'kmaq elder describes a specific shaped place near what he calls the Old Shore, a location that McCallum identifies as somewhere on the eastern coast of Nova Scotia, possibly near what is now the Canso area. The elder says that the place has steps going down that were made when the shore was not where it is now, suggesting that whoever made the descent did so at a time when the coastline was in a different position than it is today. This is not a casual detail. The coastline of the maritime provinces was significantly different at various points in the past, most relevantly during and immediately after the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were much lower and the coast extended considerably further out than its current position. If the descent the elder was describing was made when the shore was not where it is now, it was made at least 8,000 years ago and possibly much earlier. McCallum, to his credit, recognized the potential significance of this chronological detail and pressed the elder on it. The elder's response, as McCallum records it, was that the old shore time was when the world was different and that the people who made the steps were from that time. He could not, or would not, say more about who those people were or where they had come from, but he was very clear that the steps existed, that they could be found if you knew where to look, and that they went down to a place that the water had been when the water was lower. This intersection between the staircase accounts and the question of sea level change in the post-glacial period opens up one of the most scientifically interesting aspects of this entire inquiry, because it is not just the Mi'kmaq accounts that point in this direction. There is a growing body of underwater archaeological evidence from around the world that shows that humans were building and living in places that are now submerged, and that the underwater environment has preserved features that would have been lost on land. In the Great Lakes region specifically, archaeologists have found what appear to be hunting structures, caribou drive lanes, at depths that place their construction at least 9,000 years ago, when the lakes were at a lower level. These structures, which include stone alignments that would have been used to guide animal migrations across a landscape that is now underwater, were first documented by a team from the University of Michigan in a paper published in 2009, and they represent the clearest archaeological evidence from Canada of large-scale stone construction by pre-agricultural peoples. The people who built those underwater drive lanes were doing something that requires coordination, planning, knowledge of animal behavior, knowledge of landscape, and the ability to move and place large amounts of stone in organized patterns. They were not, by any reasonable definition, people who did not build in stone. They were people who built in stone when building in stone was the appropriate technology for what they needed to do. And if they were building in stone along the shores of the Great Lakes 9,000 years ago, the question of whether they, or their predecessors, or their cultural descendants, were also carving descents into the bedrock of the shield is not a question that should be dismissed without evidence. Let us follow the accounts further, because the 19th and early 20th century material is only the beginning. The middle of the 20th century, particularly the period from the 1930s through the 1960s, was a time of massive infrastructure development in Canada. The building of highways and railways and hydroelectric facilities and mining operations that required cutting into the bedrock of the shield in ways and at depths that had never previously been attempted. And this period produced a corresponding wave of reports, most of them never made public, of anomalous underground features encountered in the course of construction work. In 1938, workers excavating for a road cut north of what is now Thunder Bay, Ontario, broke through into a cavity in the rock. The cavity was not large, by the accounts of the workers who reported it, perhaps 8 feet wide and 12 feet long at its widest, but it was clearly not a natural formation. The walls were smooth in a way that the surrounding rock was not. There was what one worker described as a ledge running along one wall at a consistent height, as if it had been intended as a surface for placing things. And at one end of the cavity, descending at an angle into the rock below, were what the workers described as 4 steps, cut into the stone, each approximately 20 inches wide and 8 inches in rise. The cavity was below the level of the existing ground surface. There was no dirt or organic material inside it. There was no glacial till. The air inside it was cold and dry and still. The foreman on the site, a man named Henry Whitmore, wrote a letter about this discovery to the Provincial Department of Mines. The letter is in the provincial archives. The Department of Mines replied that the feature was likely a natural result of the fracturing and differential weathering characteristics of the local rock, and that no further investigation was warranted. Whitmore, apparently not satisfied with this response, wrote a second letter in which he said that he had experience with the natural fracturing characteristics of the local rock, and that what he had seen was not consistent with them. There is no record of a response to the second letter. In 1952, a pipeline construction crew working in northern Saskatchewan encountered, at a depth of approximately 20 feet below the surface, a passage in the rock that did not appear on any geological survey. The passage was approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, running in what the crew supervisor, a man named Frank Delaney, described as a straight line for at least 30 feet, before the construction schedule required the crew to keep moving. Delaney noted in his written account, which he submitted to the pipeline company and which is preserved in that company's records, that the passage walls were smooth and that the floor of the passage descended at a consistent angle downward in the direction opposite to the one they had broken in from. He did not describe steps specifically, but he described a consistent descent and smooth walls, and a sense that the feature was intentional rather than geological. And then the crew filled it in and moved on, because they had a pipeline to lay and a deadline to meet. The 1960s and 1970s brought the beginning of serious resource extraction in the far north of Canada, in regions that had previously been too remote and too economically marginal to attract major industrial investment. The opening of mining operations in the territories, the construction of roads to service them, the drilling programs that accompanied them, all produced encounters with the bedrock of the shield at depths and in locations that had never previously been explored. And the pattern of anomalous features continued. A geologist working for a mineral exploration company in what is now Nunavut in 1968 filed an internal report describing a feature encountered in a drill core that she could not account for by any natural geological process. The core showed a section of rock that had been worked in a way consistent with tool use, specifically a series of parallel marks in the stone that the geologist identified as percussion marks, consistent with someone striking the rock repeatedly with a hard instrument. The marks were at a depth of approximately 60 feet below the current surface. The company's chief geologist reviewed the report and concluded that the marks were probably the result of differential mineral deposition, creating the appearance of regularity. The geologist who wrote the original report was not satisfied with this explanation. She noted in a private letter to a colleague, which the colleague preserved and which eventually found its way into a university archive, that the explanation her chief geologist had offered was physically impossible given the mineralogy of the core, and that she believed the marks were artificial. She never published this assessment. The internal report was filed. The private letter sat in an archive for 30 years before anyone read it. This is the texture of the suppression. If suppression is even the right word for a process that is mostly self-organizing, mostly the result of individual decisions made in institutional contexts that are not designed to accommodate the kind of information these people were encountering. Each decision is reasonable in its local context. Each act of non-publication, each explanation, that is, not really an explanation, each private letter that goes nowhere, is understandable when you look at it in isolation. The geologist who wrote the internal report had a career to protect. The foreman who wrote the second letter about the Thunder Bay road cut was not the kind of person whose view on geological anomalies was going to be taken seriously by the Department of Mines. Aldous Hearn, 100 years earlier, simply did not have a category for what he had seen. But the cumulative effect of all these individual decisions is that the official record contains almost nothing about these features, while the unofficial record, scattered across archives and private collections, and the memories of communities whose oral traditions are still very much alive, contains quite a lot. And the gap between the official record and the unofficial record is itself a kind of evidence. It is evidence that something is there, something that keeps being encountered and keeps being looked away from. In 2003, a team of researchers from a Canadian university who were conducting a survey of anomalous geological features in the Shield using ground-penetrating radar technology filed a report with their institution describing a series of underground voids in a section of rock north of Lake Superior that showed characteristics inconsistent with natural cavity formation. The voids were connected in what the researchers described as a linear pattern, meaning they were arranged in a line rather than distributed randomly, which is not consistent with any known natural geological process in shield rock. Several of the voids showed what the GPR signature suggested were regular internal surfaces that were flat and angled in ways that natural cavities do not typically produce. And one of the voids showed a signature that the researchers described, carefully and with appropriate hedging, as consistent with a descent, a series of regular surfaces at decreasing depths. The team applied for funding to conduct a ground-truthing expedition, meaning they wanted to actually dig down to these features and look at them. The funding was denied. The report was published in a minor journal with a very small readership and was cited by almost no one. The researchers moved on to other projects. The voids are still there, presumably, under several feet of Canadian Shield bedrock north of Lake Superior, inaccessible for want of the modest resources that would be required to examine them properly. The question of resources is not a trivial one. Archaeology in Canada, like archaeology everywhere, is expensive and competitive and politically complicated. The projects that get funded are the projects that promise to produce results consistent with the existing theoretical frameworks, because those are the projects that reviewers can evaluate, that journal editors can assess, that institutional committees can approve. a project that promises to produce results that will require a complete rethinking of the timeline of human occupation in North America, is not an easy sell, even when the preliminary evidence for the anomalies in question is solid. This is not a conspiracy. It is the normal operation of any large institution trying to allocate scarce resources in a context where the range of things that could be studied vastly exceeds the resources available to study them. But the effect is that the anomalies remain unstudied. The questions remain unanswered, and the gap between what the official record says and what the unofficial record suggests keeps growing. Let us talk about the mechanics of cutting stone, because this is one of the places where the conversation often gets stuck, and getting it unstuck requires understanding something about what is and is not possible with pre-metal technology. The standard objection to the idea of pre-contact stone architecture in the Canadian Shield is that the indigenous peoples of this region did not have the tools required to cut granite and gneiss at any significant scale. The specific claim is that without metal tools, specifically iron or steel, cutting hard stone is essentially impossible, or so time-consuming and labor-intensive as to be practically equivalent to impossible. This is wrong, not a little wrong, comprehensively wrong. And the evidence that it is wrong is distributed across multiple continents and multiple archaeological contexts. The oldest large-scale stone cutting in the world was done without metal tools of any kind. The builders of the Egyptian pyramids, the megalithic monuments of Europe, the temples of Mesoamerica, all of them worked in stone before the widespread availability of iron. They used tools made from harder stone to cut softer stone. They used fire setting and water to exploit the thermal expansion and contraction of rock. They used wooden wedges driven into natural fracture lines to split stone along its grain, and they had something that is often underestimated in accounts of ancient stone working, which is a very good understanding of the specific properties of the specific materials they were working with. Granite and gneiss, the primary rock types of the Canadian Shield, are hard, but they are not uniform. They have grain, they have fracture planes, they have lines of weakness that run through them that a skilled stoneworker can read and exploit. Someone who has spent their life in the Shield, who has watched how the rock fractures in winter cold and spring thaw, who has learned from people who themselves learned from people going back many generations, would know these properties intimately. And with that knowledge, and with tools made from quartzite or other hard stone, and with fire and water and time, the cutting of regular steps into a fissure in the Shield is not just possible. It is achievable by a small number of people working over a period of days or weeks. The wear patterns that appear in the accounts, the smoothness of the edges, the worn quality of the treads, are themselves evidence about the nature of the construction. Natural fractures in granite do not produce smooth edges through simple weathering. The smoothing of stone edges by weathering requires either the abrasive action of water carrying sediment, which would produce a very different kind of surface than what the observers describe, or the mechanical action of repeated contact with something soft, like feet or hands or tools, moving along the same path over and over again. The smooth edges that Hearn measured and that Emmett described and that other observers noted are consistent with the latter. They are consistent with long use. The question of how long is one that the accounts cannot precisely answer, but the absence of glacial till that Emmett noted in the 1912 mining survey report is a clue. The glaciers retreated from most of the Canadian Shield between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. Any cavity that existed in the rock and was not actively maintained during and after the glacial period would have accumulated a characteristic deposit of glacial debris. The absence of this deposit means one of two things. Either the cavity was constructed after the glaciers retreated, which would limit its age to no more than 10,000 years, which is still considerably older than the official timeline of human occupation in the region would comfortably allow. Or the cavity was actively maintained during and after the glacial period, cleared of glacial debris as it accumulated, which would require a continuity of occupation and activity at the specific location, extending back through the Ice Age itself. The second possibility is the one that the oral traditions point toward, with their references to a time before the current peoples, a time when the world was different, when the old ones or the ancient ones or the first builders were active in ways that are now beyond the direct memory, even of the deepest oral traditions. If the keeping places, to use the Cree language, were in continuous use from before the last glacial maximum through the period of glaciation and into the post-glacial period. Then they would show exactly the characteristics that the accounts describe. Smooth edges from long use, no glacial till because the till was cleared, and a depth and complexity of indigenous oral tradition about them that does not fit the recency model because the memory of these places is too old and too specific to have been formed in the few thousand years that the official timeline allows. Now I want to tell you about a specific location, and I want to be careful about how I do it, because the details I am about to give are based on accounts from multiple sources that all point to the same general area without precisely agreeing on the exact location. What I can say with confidence is that in the Nipigon country, the territory north and east of Lake Nipigon, in what is now northwestern Ontario, there is a landscape that has produced more reports of anomalous underground features than almost anywhere else in the Shield. And I can say that this is not a coincidence, because the Nipigon country has a set of geological and geographical characteristics that would make it a logical location for exactly the kind of feature the accounts describe. Lake Nipigon itself is remarkable. It is the largest lake in Ontario, sitting at an elevation well above Lake Superior into which it drains, and it is one of the least studied large bodies of fresh water in North America. The shield rock surrounding it is deeply fractured, dissected by fault lines and fissures that run deep into the earth and that have been exploited by water for millions of years. There are natural caves in the Nipigon country. There are natural passages in the bedrock, and there are things that are not natural. In the early 1970s, a hydroelectric survey team working in the Nipigon drainage documented a series of anomalous features in the bedrock along one of the river's tributary drainages. The features included what the team's geologist described as apparent modification of natural rock faces, including areas where regular marks in the stone suggested tool use, and what she described in her survey notes as a possible constructed passage, a section of rock that appeared to have been widened and smoothed beyond what natural processes would account for, and that descended at an angle into the earth in a way that was consistent with deliberate engineering. The survey notes are in the archive of the provincial utility company that commissioned the survey. They were not included in the published summary of the survey's findings, which focused on the hydrological data relevant to the proposed hydroelectric development. The geologist who made the note about the possible constructed passage never publicly discussed it. But the note exists, in her handwriting, in a file that also contains her other observations from the same survey, observations about the hydrology and the geology that were clearly the product of careful, professional attention. She was not careless. She was not given to fantasy. She saw what she saw and she wrote it down and she moved on, because that was what the institutional context required of her. More recently, in the early 2000s, a researcher working on a project documenting the oral traditions of Anishinaabe communities in the Nipigon area spoke with several elders who described, independently and without coordination, the same general location as a place where one could go down. The description was not of a specific feature, but of a general territory, a bend in a particular river, an outcrop of a particular kind of rock, a place where the old people knew to look for the way into the earth. The researcher noted that the descriptions from different elders, when mapped, all pointed to the same area, an area that overlaps with the location of the anomalous features documented by the 1970s survey team. This kind of convergence between the documentary record and the oral tradition, pointing to the same location from completely independent starting points, is one of the strongest forms of evidence available in this inquiry. It is not conclusive. It does not prove that carved staircases exist at that specific location, but it suggests very strongly that something is there, something that multiple independent sources from radically different cultural backgrounds have each noticed, and each described in ways that are different in their specific language and framework, but consistent in their essential claim. There is a descent into the earth at this place. There has been one for a very long time, and the people who know about it are not talking about it in the context where it might get properly investigated. Why not? This is a question that deserves a full answer, because the easy answer, that Indigenous communities are protecting sacred sites from outside interference, is true as far as it goes, but does not fully account for the silence. The fuller answer has several components. The first is trust. The history of what happens when Indigenous communities in Canada share information about significant cultural and spiritual sites with the wider Canadian society is not a history that encourages further sharing. Sacred sites have been excavated without consent, their contents taken to museums, the communities who protected them sidelined in the process of their own cultural heritage being turned into academic data. This history is not ancient. Some of it happened in living memory. The institutional archaeology of Canada has, slowly and incompletely, been reckoning with this history, but the reckoning is far from complete, and the trust it would require to share sensitive information about significant underground sites is not yet reliably there. The second component is the nature of the knowledge itself. The oral traditions that describe the underground places are not simply informational. They are not the equivalent of an address on a map. They are embedded in ceremonial and spiritual frameworks that determine who can hold them, in what context they can be shared, and what obligations come with sharing them. Extracting the locational information from the ceremonial framework and handing it to a researcher, or a journalist, or a television documentary crew is not possible without destroying something essential about the knowledge itself. The information and its context are not separable in the way that a Western information model would require. The third component is what one Anishinaabe cultural practitioner, speaking at a conference on Indigenous knowledge and archaeological practice in Winnipeg in 2018, described as the question of what happens next. If the underground places are documented, if their existence is confirmed by scientific investigation, what then? The history of significant pre-contact sites in Canada does not inspire confidence about what happens after the scientific confirmation. They become heritage sites, they become tourist attractions, they become the subjects of academic papers that do not include the communities who knew about them. They become managed by institutions that had no relationship to them until the investigation happened. The cultural practitioner said, simply, that she did not see a reason to initiate a process whose likely outcomes were all worse than the current situation. This is a painful calculus, and I do not think she is wrong about it. But it does mean that the full story of what is beneath the surface of Canada is probably not going to emerge through the normal channels of institutional archaeology, at least not anytime soon. It is going to emerge, if it emerges at all, through a different kind of process, one that begins with the relationships and the trust that the history of Canadian colonialism has made extremely difficult to build. Let me take you further north, because the Shield is not the only geological context in Canada where these features have been reported. The Rocky Mountains and the ranges that parallel them through British Columbia and the Yukon contain a different kind of underground architecture, one that appears in the accounts less frequently than the Shield features, but that is, in some ways, even more difficult to explain in terms of natural processes. Mountain caves in the limestone and karst terrain of Western Canada are not unusual. The Rockies are full of them, some of the most spectacular cave systems in the world. But what is unusual is the accounts, again distributed across documentary sources and oral traditions, of features within or adjacent to cave systems that show modification beyond what natural cave formation processes produce. Features that include, in multiple accounts, descents that are too regular and too consistent to be the result of natural flowstone formation or differential erosion. In 1947, a parks ranger named Thomas Breckinridge, who was conducting a survey of cave features in what is now a national park in the Rocky Mountains, wrote a report describing a section of one cave system in which natural cave passage gave way to what he described as a constructed descent, a series of cut surfaces in the floor of the passage that formed a staircase descending approximately 30 feet before the passage became too narrow for him to continue. Breckinridge was an experienced caver. He was familiar with the full range of natural cave formations produced by karst processes. He was explicit in his report that what he had found was not a natural formation. He recommended that the feature be reported to the relevant authorities and investigated. The recommendation went to the Parks Administration. The Parks Administration forwarded it to the Geological Survey of Canada. The GSC sent a brief response noting that the feature would be evaluated at the earliest opportunity. There is no record of any evaluation. Breckinridge retired in 1963. His report sits in the Parks Archive, in a filing category for anomalous features that does not appear to have been actively maintained or reviewed since sometime in the 1950s. The Rocky Mountain and BC interior indigenous traditions about underground places, primarily the traditions of the Nlaka Pamuks, the Sekwepemp, and the Stony Nakoda people, describe these places in terms that are consistent with the Shield traditions in their emphasis on preparation and purpose, but different in their specific details. In the mountain traditions, the underground places tend to be associated with specific seasonal practices and with the movements of animals through the landscape. There is a tradition, preserved in the Nlaka Pamuk's oral culture, of places where the mountain opens to receive what is given, and where what is given is returned when the time is right. The receiving and returning is described in ways that are clearly metaphorical, but that point consistently toward physical underground spaces that were used in specific ceremonial contexts associated with the cycles of animal migration. A researcher named Anne Galway, working in the 1990s on a project documenting Nlaka Pamuk's oral tradition about landscape features, recorded an account from an elder that described a specific place in the mountains where there was an entrance in the rock that had been prepared for use. The elder described the entrance as having been made by people who were very skilled with stone, and as providing access to a series of chambers below ground. The elder was not willing to specify the location, but was willing to say that the entrance involved a descent that was structured, that it had form, that it had been made in a particular way for a particular reason. Galway noted in her field notes that the elder's description was consistent with a constructed staircase in every particular, except that he never used that specific word, instead using a term that she translated as the going down way. The going down way. It appears in multiple forms, across multiple indigenous traditions, across a geographic range that covers most of the northern half of North America. In the Anishinaabe tradition, it is the prepared path that the skilled ones follow. In the Haudenosaunee tradition, it is the descent to the place where the world thins. In the Cree tradition, it is the way to the keeping places. In the Nlaka Pamuk's tradition, it is the prepared entrance to the chambers below. In the Mi'kmaq tradition, it is the shaped way down into the old shore. These are not the same tradition. They are not in contact with each other in the way that would be required for borrowing or influence to account for the similarities. They are independent accounts, from independent cultural frameworks, describing what sounds very much like the same type of feature in multiple locations across an enormous geographic range. The going down way is not a metaphor in any of these traditions. It is not a spiritual concept that happens to use physical language. It is a physical thing that has spiritual significance. The physical and the spiritual are not separate categories in any of these cultural frameworks, and so the distinction between describing a physical feature and describing a sacred one is not the distinction it would be in a Western analytical context. But the physical feature is there. Multiple, independent, cultural traditions say it is there. And a century and a half of documentary accounts from people who had no cultural motive to invent what they saw confirm that something is there. Let us go even deeper into the comparative context, because one of the most powerful arguments for taking the Canadian staircase accounts seriously is that they are not unique in the world. They are not even unusual in the global context of ancient underground architecture. The world is full of places where human beings, at very great expense of time and effort, cut into the bedrock of the earth and went down. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta is the best documented example of prehistoric underground architecture in the world. Cut entirely from the living limestone of the island of Malta, it descends through 3 levels to a depth of approximately 12 meters, and was in use as a ceremonial and burial space for several thousand years, beginning approximately 5,000 years ago. The cutting required to create it was done with stone tools and fire, and the quality of the workmanship is extraordinary. The upper chambers are smoothed and decorated. The lower chambers have an acoustic quality that produces a resonant standing wave at a specific frequency, a quality that researchers believe was intentional and was used in ceremonial contexts. The people who built it left no written records of their purposes. We know about their work only because the physical structure survived. The underground city of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia, Turkey, is cut from the soft volcanic rock of the Anatolian Plateau and descends through 18 levels to a depth of approximately 60 meters below the surface. It was in use from at least the Iron Age and possibly earlier, and could shelter approximately 20,000 people. The stone cutting required to create it, while done in considerably softer rock than the Canadian Shield, required the same kind of sustained organizational effort and technical knowledge that any large-scale underground construction implies. The Longyu Caves in Zhejiang Province, China, are a system of artificial caves cut into sandstone over a period that is still not fully understood. Discovered in 1992, when local residents drained a pond and found a series of chambers that had been submerged for an unknown period. The chambers are large, with ceilings up to 30 meters high, and they show evidence of tool use in their walls, including regular parallel marks left by the tools used to cut the stone. No written records of their construction have been found. Their purpose is unknown. Their date of construction is uncertain. They were simply there, under the water, waiting to be found. These examples are not presented to suggest that the underground features in the Canadian Shield are identical in form or purpose to the underground features in Malta or Turkey or China. They are not. The geological and cultural contexts are all different. But they are presented to make the simple point that pre-industrial human beings routinely cut large, complex, multi-level structures into stone, all over the world, over very long periods of time, for purposes that range from practical shelter to ceremonial space to storage to connection between the living and the dead. The assumption that the peoples of pre-contact North America did not do this, that the Canadian Shield was somehow exempt from the universal human tendency to go underground, is not based on evidence. It is based on an absence of documentation, which is not the same thing. The absence of documentation is partly a function of what kinds of evidence survive. Stone survives, wood does not. Fire-hardened clay survives. Organic materials do not, except in very specific conditions. Underground stone structures in the Canadian Shield, if they exist, would survive indefinitely. They would be exactly where they were left, protected from the weathering and erosion that destroy surface features. They would look, to anyone who found them, very much like what the surveyors and loggers and miners have been describing for 150 years. Regular surfaces, smooth edges, consistent angles, darkness below. One of the questions that comes up when this material is presented to archaeologists or to the general public is the question of purpose. What were these places for? Why would anyone cut steps into the Canadian Shield and go down into the darkness below? This is a reasonable question, but it contains an assumption that is worth examining. It assumes that the things people do underground are the same kinds of things they do on the surface, just in a different location, and that we should therefore be able to identify the purpose from features analogous to surface structures we already understand. This assumption is probably wrong. The underground, in nearly every human cultural tradition that has a relationship to it, is not simply the surface with the roof coming down. It is a qualitatively different kind of space. It is removed from the rhythms of light and sound and weather that govern surface life. It has its own acoustic properties, its own temperature characteristics, its own relationship to water and darkness. In many traditions, and there is a case to be made that this is a universal tendency of human psychological response to underground space. It is associated with the fundamental categories of being and non-being, with what comes before birth and what comes after death, with the source and the destination of what is alive. This is not primitive superstition. It is a response to a real phenomenological difference between being underground and being on the surface. Going into the earth changes your experience of being a conscious creature. It changes your experience of time, of sound, of your own body. And people have always recognized this change and made use of it. The ceremonies conducted in the deep chambers of the painted caves of France and Spain were not conducted there because the surface was unavailable. The surface was available. The people who made the paintings went underground deliberately, carrying torches and materials through narrow passages and over significant distances, because the underground was necessary to the purposes of what they were doing. The specific acoustic properties of specific chambers were used deliberately, as researchers like Rupert Till and Stephen Waller have demonstrated. The places where paintings were made were not chosen at random. They were chosen for specific properties that the underground space had and that the surface did not. If the underground features of the Canadian Shield were used for analogous purposes, for ceremony, for the transmission of specific kinds of knowledge in specific kinds of conditions, for the altered consciousness states that the underground reliably produces when experienced in the dark by someone who is prepared properly for that experience, then their purpose was not something that left obvious archaeological traces. It was not storage in the material sense. It was not habitation. It was the kind of purposeful human activity that is almost entirely invisible in the archaeological record and that can only be reconstructed from the oral traditions that describe it. And the oral traditions do describe it. The Cree concept of keeping, the Anishinaabe concept of following the path that knows where it is going, the Haudenosaunee concept of the place where the world thins, the Nlaka'pamuk's concept of the receiving and returning. These are all consistent with the use of underground space for purposes that are not primarily practical in the material sense, but that are deeply practical in the sense of maintaining the knowledge and the relationships and the ceremonial connections that make a culture coherent over very long periods of time. The underground places were not warehouses. They were not refuges. They were, in the language that the traditions use, the places where the most important things were held, and the staircases that led into them were the infrastructure of that holding. There is a contemporary dimension to this story that I have not yet fully addressed, and it is the most complicated part of what I want to tell you. In the last 20 years, the conversation about pre-contact stone architecture in Canada has begun, very slowly and very cautiously, to open up in the mainstream academic context. Not because the anomalous features have suddenly become more visible or more numerous, though in some ways they have. With the growing use of LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar in Canadian archaeological surveys, producing anomalies that are harder to simply file away than a 19th century surveyor's private journal, but because the broader context of North American archaeology has been changing in ways that make the question more thinkable than it used to be. The Bluefish Caves dating, the underwater structures in Lake Huron, the genetic evidence for multiple migration waves, the accumulating evidence that the first Americans were in North America considerably earlier and in greater diversity than the Clovis first model allows, all of these have created an intellectual environment in which a serious archaeologist can at least ask, in a seminar or a conference paper, whether the pre-contact peoples of northern Canada were doing things with stone that the official history did not account for. The asking is still cautious. The institutional resistance is still significant, but the conversation is happening in ways it was not happening 20 years ago. At the same time, the process of reconciliation between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples, incomplete and troubled as it is, has created some new spaces for the sharing of knowledge about significant sites that the previous, purely extractive relationship between academic archaeology and Indigenous communities made impossible. There are now archaeologists working in genuine partnership with Anishinaabe and Cree communities to document landscape features that the communities have knowledge of and that the academic record has not previously acknowledged. Some of this work is beginning to produce results that are slowly making their way into the published literature, and some of those results concern underground features. A paper published in a Canadian archaeology journal in 2019, authored by a team that included both academic researchers and Indigenous knowledge holders, described the results of a GPR survey conducted in a section of the Ontario Shield that Anishinaabe community members had identified as significant based on oral tradition. The survey identified a series of underground voids arranged in a pattern that the researchers described as inconsistent with natural cavity formation and consistent with intentional construction. The paper is careful and hedged and does not make claims beyond what the GPR data directly supports, but it exists. It is in the peer-reviewed literature, and it says, in the language of professional archaeology, that something made by human intelligence is under the ground of the Canadian Shield, in a location that the oral tradition of the Anishinaabe people has described as significant for as long as anyone can remember. This paper was not widely reported. It did not generate headlines. It was read by the people who read that journal and not by many others, but it represents something important. It represents the first time that the convergence between oral tradition and geophysical data about underground features in the Shield has appeared in a mainstream academic publication. And once a thing has been published, it cannot be entirely unpublished. It is in the record. It is citable. It can be built on. It is a beginning. There are researchers currently working on related questions in ways that are not yet producing published results but that deserve mention. A geologist at a Western Canadian university is conducting an analysis of the distribution of anomalous subsurface features identified in oil and gas exploration data across a section of the Western Canadian sedimentary basin that overlaps with shield geology. The analysis is examining whether the pattern of anomalies shows clustering that would be inconsistent with natural processes and consistent with deliberate location. It is early work and the results are not yet clear, but the fact that it is happening is itself significant. A team of Indigenous archaeologists, working with traditional knowledge holders from multiple nations, is in the early stages of a project to create a map of significant underground locations based entirely on oral tradition, without any ground truthing or site investigation, as a way of demonstrating the geographic scope and specificity of the Indigenous knowledge about these places before any academic research is conducted. The map, when it is complete, will be held by the participating communities rather than published, but the researchers involved have said that they hope it will eventually serve as the basis for a collaborative investigation conducted on terms that the communities control. These are small things. They are the beginning of a conversation that should have started a very long time ago. The underground features of the Canadian Shield have been there, presumably, for thousands of years. The oral traditions that describe them have been maintained, with great care and at considerable cost, for as long as the communities who hold them have existed. The documentary record of European and Euro-Canadian encounters with these features stretches back almost to the beginning of European presence in the Canadian interior. None of this is new. What is new is the possibility, fragile and uncertain but real, that these things might finally be investigated in a way that is worthy of what they represent. What they represent is the possibility that the history of human activity in North America is significantly older, significantly more complex, and significantly more architecturally sophisticated than the official account acknowledges, not because of ancient astronauts or lost civilizations in the Hollywood sense, not because of any theory that requires the abandonment of reason or the acceptance of evidence-free speculation, but because the evidence that is available, spread across a century and a half of documentary accounts and a much longer span of oral tradition, consistently points toward a conclusion that the standard framework cannot accommodate. People were in North America earlier than the official timeline says. They were doing things with stone. They were going underground. They were building descents into the earth that were regular and consistent and maintained over long periods. And whatever they were doing down there was important enough to leave a trace in the oral traditions of nations that have survived everything the colonial period threw at them and are still maintaining the knowledge of the going down way. The staircases are there. Some of them have been seen by people who left written records of what they saw. Some of them are described in the oral traditions of peoples who have been living in their vicinity since a time that makes European presence in North America look brief. Some of them have left anomalous signatures in the subsurface data collected by geophysical surveys that were looking for something else and found more than they were looking for. None of this adds up to a confirmed discovery, to a press release, to an archaeologist standing in front of a camera and saying, "We can now definitively say that pre-contact peoples in Canada built underground staircases in the Canadian Shield." But all of it adds up to something. It adds up to a question that is too consistent and too persistent and too well documented in the unofficial record to be treated as mere speculation. It adds up to a gap in the official history of this country that is shaped exactly like the thing it is missing. It adds up to the outline of a story that we do not yet have the full text of, but whose outline is clear enough that the story can be described. There were people here before the people we know about, or the people we know about were doing things that the frameworks we use to understand them do not account for. Those people went underground. They built the way down. They made the descent regular and consistent and repeatable because going down was something that needed to be done often by people who needed to find the way over a very long time. And then something changed, or many things changed over many periods, and the descent was no longer made, or was made differently, or was made only by the few who still held the knowledge of it. And the staircase remained, cut into the stone of the shield, smooth at the edges from the memory of all those footsteps, descending into a darkness that has been waiting for someone to come back with the right kind of light. The shield is still up there, the spruce trees still grow close together, and the light still goes thin and green between them. The logging roads are still maintained, some of them, and not maintained, others. The creeks still run black with tannins in the autumn, and somewhere, in a cleft in the rock above a river drainage in the Nipigon country, or in a limestone passage in the Rockies, or at the bottom of a drainage gully in northern Saskatchewan, or in any of the dozens of locations that appear in the accounts, the steps are still there, regular in width, consistent in rise, worn smooth in the way that stone wears when something has passed over it thousands of times. Going down into a darkness that the Canadian Shield has been holding for a very long time, waiting for someone who knows what they are looking at and is willing to ask the question that keeps not getting asked. What is down there? We do not know. We have not looked, not properly, not with the seriousness and the resources and the willingness to find something that does not fit that a question this important deserves. We have been looking away for 150 years, filing the reports in the wrong categories, losing the photographs, writing the explanations that explain nothing, not following up. And the ground below us is full of the things we have been looking away from, full of the evidence of a history this country has not yet found the courage to fully face. The courage would not require very much, in practical terms. It would require some funding for ground-truthing expeditions at locations already identified by converging evidence. It would require the willingness to conduct those expeditions in partnership with the indigenous communities whose oral traditions have been pointing at these locations for generations. It would require researchers willing to look at what they find without deciding in advance what they are going to see. It would require journals willing to publish results that require a rethinking rather than a confirming. None of these things are impossible. Some of them are beginning to happen. The question is whether they will happen fast enough, whether the institutional inertia and the colonial legacy and the professional conservatism that have kept this question suppressed for so long can be overcome before the sites that have survived for thousands of years are lost to the construction projects and the resource extraction and the simple passage of undocumented time that are the other face of Canadian development. The staircase in the Nipigon country is still there, probably, if it was ever found by anyone reliable enough to describe it accurately. Old Peter, who walked to the edge and looked down and said something in Ojibwe that Aldous Hearn could not translate, knew what he was looking at. He had the framework for it. He knew what it was and what it meant, and why it was where it was and who had made it. He walked away without explanation, not because he had nothing to say, but because there was no context in which what he had to say could be heard. We are, possibly, beginning to build that context. It is late. It is incomplete. The things that have been lost in the gap between what old Peter knew and what Aldous Hearn could hear are probably not fully recoverable, but some of them are still there. In the archives, in the oral traditions, in the ground itself, where the stone keeps its record with a patience that makes the entire span of documented human history look like a moment. The going down way is still there, and somewhere, in the right kind of partnership between the knowledge that has been carefully maintained and the tools that can now look underground without destroying what they find, it will be followed again. Not today, perhaps not soon, but the stone is patient. It has been patient for a very long time, and patience, when what you are waiting for is the right question asked in the right way by people who are finally ready to hear the answer, is not a failing. It is a form of confidence. That is the confidence of the Canadian Shield. It is old enough to wait. It is old enough to have been here when the first people arrived, wherever they came from, however long ago. It is old enough to have been shaped by them, carefully, along its own grain, following the lines that the rock itself suggested to hands that knew how to read them. It is old enough to have outlasted the forgetting, and it is patient enough to wait for the remembering. The wind is moving through the spruce tonight. The Tannin Dark Creek is running somewhere in the dark below the ridge. The cleft in the rock is there, if you know where to look. The steps descend into the darkness below, and the darkness below has been holding what is kept in it, patiently, without complaint, for longer than any of the official histories of this country have been keeping track. That is where we will leave it tonight, not with an answer, with a shape. The shape of what the answer might look like when it finally comes, carved into stone by people who knew what they were doing, worn smooth by all the feet that found the way before us, descending into a dark that is not empty but full, waiting at the bottom with everything it has been holding for the right person to come down and see. Rest well. The ground beneath you has been carrying its weight for a very long time. Let it carry yours for a few hours tonight. If this journey through the underground history of Canada was something that stayed with you, you can tap like and it tells whatever algorithm is listening that there are people out here who want to hear more stories like this one. If you want to keep exploring the hidden histories and the forgotten questions, and the places where the official record goes quiet right when things are getting interesting, you can subscribe, and the next story will find you when it is ready. And if you want to leave a comment, I would be very glad to know where you are tonight. What country, what city, what kind of dark is outside your window right now? These conversations travel further than the stories themselves, and knowing that someone in a place I have never been is listening to this in the dark makes the dark a little less lonely for both of us. Good night. There is another angle to this story that I have not fully explored yet, and it concerns the question of what the underground spaces felt like to the people who used them, not in a vague spiritual sense, but in the specific phenomenological sense of what the experience of being underground does to human perception and human cognition. This is not a marginal consideration. The science of what underground environments do to the human mind and body has been developing steadily for several decades, and it has produced findings that are relevant to any account of why people would go through the considerable effort of cutting staircases into hard rock. The most fundamental thing that happens when you go underground, below the level where ambient surface sound and light penetrate, is that your two primary orienting senses are removed from their normal inputs. You can no longer see the sky, the horizon, the play of light and shadow that your visual system has been calibrated by evolution to use as a primary reference. You can no longer hear the background sounds of wind and animals and water moving that your auditory system uses as constant environmental information. What remains is your body itself, your proprioceptive sense of where your limbs are in space, the feeling of the ground under your feet, the temperature of the air on your skin, and the sounds that exist specifically in the underground space, the drip of water, the movement of air through passages, the acoustic properties of the rock that surrounds you. These changes in sensory input produce specific and well-documented changes in cognitive state. People in underground environments, even people who are familiar with those environments and have no fear of them, experience alterations in the perception of time. The normal circadian cues that govern the experience of duration are removed, and with them, the sense of time as something that flows evenly and predictably. People also experience changes in the perceived quality of their own thinking, a quality that is variously described as heightened, clarified, or altered in ways that feel significant but are difficult to articulate in ordinary language. And people in underground acoustic environments, particularly those with the resonant properties that certain underground chambers produce, experience changes in auditory perception that range from the subtle to the profound, including the perception of voices and sounds that are not being generated by any external source. The acoustic properties of underground spaces are not incidental to their history of human use. They are central to it. Archaeologist Igor Reznikov, working in the painted caves of France and Spain in the 1980s and 1990s, found that the concentration of animal paintings in these caves correlates strongly with the acoustic properties of the specific locations where the paintings appear. The places where the most elaborate and numerous paintings are found are the places where the cave produces the most resonant acoustic effects. The standing waves and the flutter echoes and the strange amplifications that make sound behave in ways that do not correspond to ordinary surface acoustic experience. Reznikov proposed, and his findings have since been replicated and extended by other researchers, that the painted caves were selected and used partly for their acoustic properties, that the experience of sound in those spaces was integral to the ceremonial and cognitive purposes for which the spaces were used. If the underground features of the Canadian Shield were used for related purposes, then their acoustic properties would have been a significant factor in their selection and use. And here is where a detail from the documentary accounts becomes interesting. Several of the observers who entered these features, or who reported entering them, noted acoustic properties that were unusual. Hearn, in his 1884 journal, wrote that the sound of his voice in the fissure was strange, that it came back to him in a way that he could not account for given the size and shape of the space. Emmett, in his 1912 mining survey report, noted that the cavity had a quality he described as unusually quiet, a silence that was deeper than the ambient silence of the surrounding rock, suggesting that the space had acoustic properties that absorbed rather than reflected sound in the normal way. And Frederick Coulter, the logger who wrote to the GSC in 1889, mentioned in passing that when he called down into the passage, the sound did not come back to him, which he found unsettling. The acoustic silence that Emmett described and the non-echo that Coulter noted are consistent with a specific type of underground space, one in which the geometry of the surfaces creates constructive and destructive interference patterns that absorb certain frequencies while passing others. This is not a feature of random natural cavities. It is a feature of spaces with specific geometric properties, and it is the kind of feature that would be noticed and valued by people who were using the space for purposes involving sound, whether that sound was music or voice, or the kind of low-frequency rhythmic sound that is produced by percussion instruments used in ceremonial contexts all over the world. The connection between underground space, sound, and altered states of consciousness is one of the most robust findings in the archaeology and anthropology of human spiritual practice. It appears in the painted caves of Europe. It appears in the hypogeum of Malta, where the acoustic resonance is so carefully engineered that it produces standing waves at a frequency consistent with the male chanting voice. It appears in the kivas of the American Southwest, circular underground chambers that are used for ceremonial purposes and that are designed, among other things, for their acoustic properties. It appears in the accounts of shamanic practice from cultures on multiple continents, in which the underground journey is both a physical descent and a sensory immersion that produces specific kinds of cognitive experience valued for their revelatory qualities. If the underground features of the Canadian Shield were part of this same broad tradition of human use of underground space for purposes of cognitive alteration and ceremonial practice, then they fit into a pattern that is genuinely global, genuinely ancient, and genuinely supported by archaeological evidence from many contexts other than the specific Canadian one. This does not prove that the features exist, but it does mean that if they exist, there is a well-established context in which to understand what they were for. They were for the same thing that underground spaces have been used for everywhere that human beings have gone underground deliberately. They were for the experience of being underground, which is a different kind of experience than being on the surface, and which produces specific kinds of awareness that human beings have found valuable for specific kinds of purposes, for as long as we have evidence of human beings going underground at all. The earliest evidence of deliberate human use of underground space is much older than the painted caves of France and Spain. It goes back to the early Middle Stone Age in southern Africa, where there is evidence of human use of caves not just as shelter, but as spaces with specific ceremonial and cognitive significance. There is evidence from the Pinnacle Point Cave Complex in South Africa, which we mentioned earlier in the context of ochre use, that humans were using cave spaces for purposes beyond shelter as early as 160,000 years ago. The deliberate selection of ochre and its careful processing in a cave context suggests a relationship to underground space that is already ceremonial, already associating the underground with specific kinds of material and practice that have significance beyond the purely practical. The tradition of going underground for specific purposes, the tradition that eventually produced the painted caves of Europe and the hypogeum of Malta and the kivas of the Southwest and the underground temples of Mesoamerica and the carved descents of the Canadian Shield, is therefore not a local invention or a regional curiosity. It is one of the most broadly distributed features of human spiritual and cognitive practice, appearing in virtually every part of the world where human beings have had access to underground space and the knowledge and the reason to use it. The Canadian examples, if they are what the accounts suggest they are not anomalies. They are local expressions of a universal human tendency. But local expressions matter. They are shaped by their specific geological and ecological and cultural contexts, and the local expression in the Canadian Shield has features that are specific to that context and worth understanding on their own terms. The Shield is extremely old rock. It has a specific texture and a specific set of acoustic properties that differ from the limestone of the European painted caves and the soft tufa of the Cappadocian underground cities and the sandstone of the Longyu caves in China. Working in shield rock requires a specific relationship to the material, a knowledge of where it will yield and where it will not, a patience that is calibrated to the pace of granite rather than the pace of softer stone. The people who cut the steps in the shield did not just choose to go underground in the way that people in other contexts chose to go underground. They chose to go underground through granite, which is a specific and demanding choice. And the reason for that choice The reason for not finding a softer stone to work or a natural cave to use is probably that the specific location mattered. The specific fissure in the specific ridge above the specific river was where the work needed to be done, because that was the place with the specific properties that the work required. The acoustic properties of that specific geological formation, the relationship of that specific location to the surrounding landscape, to the waterways and the fault lines, and the outcrops of specific minerals that the Shield peoples used to navigate and orient in their territory. The memory of that specific place, encoded in the oral tradition of the community as a place that was significant, that had always been significant, that would remain significant as long as the tradition was maintained. The place mattered. And because the place mattered, and because the place was granite, the steps were cut in granite, with whatever tools were available, over whatever time was required. In the way that the rock itself suggested, following its grain, working with its fracture planes, finishing what the rock had begun, and then they went down, whatever they went down for, and whatever they found at the bottom, in the dark, in the acoustic silence or the resonant hum, with the surface world removed and the underground world present in all its particular qualities of cold and weight and stillness. Whatever they found was worth the cutting, and worth the keeping, and worth the maintenance across generations and centuries, and possibly millennia, that the smooth edges of the steps imply. We do not know what they found. We have not gone down to look, but we have, if we are paying attention, the outlines of it, in the Cree word for keeping, in the Anishinaabe description of the prepared path, in the Haudenosaunee account of the place where the world thins, in the Micmac elders' description of steps that go down to where the shore used to be, in Thomas's refusal to approach the fissure, which was not fear but something more considered, in old Peter's words in Ojibwe that Aldous Hearn could not translate, but that were clearly not random, not casual, not what you say when you look at something that does not matter. What old Peter said, standing at the edge of the fissure, in the spruce woods of northern Ontario, in the 14th of August, 1884, was the most recent layer of something that was already very old when he said it. It was part of a tradition of understanding and relationship with these places that extended back further than his own memory, or the memory of his teachers, or their teachers. It was a word, or a phrase, that carried the weight of all that accumulated knowledge, all that careful maintenance of the relationship between the people above and whatever was held in the keeping places below. And Hearn, who could not translate it, who had no framework for it, who filed it away in his private journal because his official report had no category for it, nonetheless preserved it. The preservation was accidental, but preservation is preservation, whatever its motivation. Let me now turn to something that has been present in this account from the beginning, but that I have not yet directly addressed. The question of whether the features described in the accounts are a single phenomenon or multiple phenomena that are being grouped together for convenience. This is a legitimate methodological question, and it deserves a careful answer. The accounts span a very large geographic area. The Canadian Shield covers most of Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, parts of Alberta, most of the Northwest Territories, all of Nunavut, and parts of the northern states of the American Midwest. The limestone and karst terrain of the Rocky Mountains and their associated ranges covers most of British Columbia and Alberta. The maritime region, where the Mi'kmaq accounts originate, is geologically distinct from both. The oral traditions that describe these features come from nations with distinct histories, distinct languages, distinct cultural frameworks. The documentary accounts come from different periods, different industries, different geographic locations. Is it reasonable to treat all of this as a single phenomenon? In one sense, no. A carved staircase in a fissure in the granitic shield of northern Ontario is not the same thing as a carved descent in a limestone cave in the Rockies. The geology is different. The construction methods that would have been required are different. The cultural contexts in which they were made and used are different. Treating them as identical would be an oversimplification. But, in another sense, yes. The consistency of description across all these diverse contexts, the consistent emphasis on regularity and precision, and smooth edges indicating use, and the absence of geological debris that should be present, the consistent presence in the oral traditions of language about prepared descents and keeping places and ways that were made rather than found. These consistencies, suggest that the diverse accounts are describing real features that share essential characteristics, even if they differ in specific details. They are not the same construction in the same place. They are the same kind of construction, made by different people at different times and places for related purposes, using materials and methods appropriate to their specific geological context. This is not unusual in the archaeology of underground space. The painted caves of Europe are not all identical. They differ in geology, in the specific techniques used to make the paintings, in the specific imagery chosen, in their relationship to the surrounding landscape. But they are clearly expressions of a shared tradition, a shared understanding of what underground space is for and how it should be used and marked. Similarly, the carved descents of the Canadian Shield, if they are what the accounts suggest they are probably not all identical. They are probably expressions of a broadly shared tradition, adapted to different geological and cultural contexts by different communities over a very long period of time. The broadness of the tradition is actually one of its most significant features. If these were isolated, local inventions, you would expect more variability in the basic features and less consistency in the oral tradition accounts. You would expect the stories told about these places in different communities to be more diverse, to emphasize different features, to describe different purposes. Instead, across all the diversity of the specific accounts and the specific traditions, there is a remarkable core consistency: the going down way, the prepared descent, the keeping places, the places where the world thins. These are not identical concepts, but they are clearly pointing at the same kind of thing. A consistent tradition about underground places, distributed across a geographic range covering most of northern North America, maintained across cultural and linguistic boundaries that would normally prevent this kind of consistency, is the kind of pattern that, in any other archaeological context, would be taken as strong evidence of a real shared phenomenon. It is the kind of evidence that prompts researchers to look for the physical correlate of the tradition, to go out and look for the thing the tradition is describing. In this case, the physical correlates are the accounts from the documentary record, and the accounts from the documentary record confirm that people who went into the field and encountered the landscape directly have been finding things consistent with what the tradition describes for 150 years. The problem is not evidence. The evidence is there, distributed, fragmented, largely unpublished, but there. The problem is the framework. The framework within which the evidence has to be evaluated in the Canadian academic and institutional context is not currently equipped to handle it. The framework assumes a specific timeline of human occupation in North America. It assumes specific patterns of activity and capability for the pre-contact peoples of the Shield. It assumes, most fundamentally, that underground stone architecture in northern Canada would have been noted and documented in the archaeological record if it existed, and that the near absence of such documentation in the official record means the near absence of such architecture in the ground. Each of these assumptions is contestable. The timeline is being revised. The capability assumptions are not well supported by the evidence from comparable geological and cultural contexts elsewhere in the world. And the argument from absence of documentation to absence of the thing documented is the kind of argument that collapses quickly when you look at how the documentation process actually worked in the Canadian case, which is to say, not at all well when it came to anomalous features that did not fit existing frameworks. What would it take to change the framework? In the short term, not very much. A well-documented, properly conducted ground investigation at any of the several locations where the convergence of documentary and oral tradition evidence is strongest would produce data that could not be easily explained within the existing framework. The GPR anomalies identified by the 2019 paper are a starting point. The location in the Nipigon country where multiple independent sources converge is another. The specific site in northern Saskatchewan where the 1,952 pipeline crew documented a linear passage is a third. Any one of these, properly investigated by a team that includes both technical expertise and meaningful Indigenous community partnership, could produce the kind of evidence that would require a rethinking. The question is not whether the investigation is possible, it is whether the will exists to conduct it, and whether the resources can be assembled, and whether the institutional and community trust required to do it properly can be built. These are not primarily scientific questions. They are political and social and historical questions, questions about the relationship between Canadian institutions and Indigenous communities, about who controls the investigation of significant sites, about what counts as evidence and who gets to decide. They are the hardest kind of questions, which is probably why they have not been answered yet. But they are being asked. They are being asked by the small group of researchers who are working at the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and Canadian archaeology. They are being asked by Indigenous cultural practitioners who are beginning to see that the question of pre-contact stone architecture is not just an academic curiosity, but a question about the depth and sophistication of their own traditions in ways that the colonial history of Canada has systematically denied. They are being asked by a younger generation of archaeologists who have grown up in the intellectual environment created by the Bluefish Cave dates and the Lake Huron underwater structures and the genetic evidence for multiple migration waves, and who do not have the same investment in the official timeline that their predecessors had. And they are being asked, in a different way, by the people who keep encountering these features by accident in the course of other work. The hikers, the resource industry workers, the rural property owners, who call their local archaeological office or university department or First Nations liaison and say that they found something that does not fit, that they found steps in the rock somewhere they were not supposed to be. These people are not researchers. They do not have frameworks or methodologies, but they have eyes, and they are looking at a landscape that is full of things the official history of Canada has not yet fully come to terms with. The staircase beneath the spruce trees in the Nipigon country, if it is there, is not the most important thing in this story. The most important thing is the gap between what is there and what the official record says is there, because that gap is where the real history is hiding. Not the history of what was built and when and by whom, though that history matters and deserves to be told, but the history of why it was hidden and what it cost to keep it hidden and what it will take to bring it back into the light. That history is the history of Canada's relationship with the deep past of this land, with the peoples who have known that deep past directly through their oral traditions and their ceremonial practices and their intimate relationship with the landscape, and with the question of whether the country Canada has become is capable of hearing what those peoples have known all along. The staircases are one version of that question. There will be others, and the answer, when it comes, will not be just an archaeological finding. It will be a measure of what kind of country Canada is choosing to be. The night is quiet above the shield, the rock is patient below it, the steps where they are still worn smooth, the darkness below them is still full, and the people who know the going down way are still here, still holding the knowledge, still waiting for the moment when the context is right and the trust is built and the question is finally asked in a way that allows for the full and honest answer. That moment has not yet arrived, but the question is being asked more loudly than it was 10 years ago, more loudly than it was 20 years ago, more loudly, probably, than it has been asked at any point in the colonial history of this country. And questions that are asked loudly enough, persistently enough, by enough people, in enough contexts, eventually get answered. The rock is patient. The people who hold the knowledge of it are patient. The answer is there, below the surface, waiting. And now, in the last hours of this journey beneath the surface of Canada, I want to tell you about the people who are closest to this knowledge. Not the researchers, not the documentary makers, not the archivists who found the letters in the wrong files. The people who are closest to it are the ones who never lost it. The elders of the Anishinaabe, and the Cree and the Haudenosaunee, and the Micmac and the Nlaka Pamuks, and the dozens of other nations whose traditions contain the memory of the going down way. The people whose knowledge has survived everything that the colonial period could throw at it, and is still, in this moment, alive. There is something remarkable about a tradition that has maintained specific information about specific places in a specific landscape across hundreds and possibly thousands of years. It is not remarkable because of anything mystical about it. It is remarkable because it is an organizational and cognitive achievement of the first order, the sustained, deliberate transmission of detailed knowledge about the physical world through the medium of story and ceremony and relationship. The oral traditions that describe the underground places of the Canadian Shield are not myths, in the sense that the word is sometimes used to mean false stories or primitive explanations. They are repositories of information about the landscape, encoded in forms that are adapted for transmission across generations and across the disruptions that every human community faces, and maintained through the kinds of social structures and ceremonial commitments that make long-term knowledge transmission possible. The disruptions that the oral traditions of the Shield peoples have survived are extraordinary. The epidemics that killed a significant fraction of the indigenous population of North America in the first century of European contact, the deliberate suppression of indigenous languages and ceremonial practices through the residential school system, and the assimilation policies of the Canadian government, the dispossession of traditional territories that removed communities from the landscapes in which their knowledge was embedded, the ongoing pressures of economic marginalization and social disruption that make the transmission of any complex cultural knowledge difficult. Through all of this, the knowledge of the underground places has survived, not fully, not without loss. There are elders who say that the full knowledge of specific sites has been lost, that the person who held it died before they could fully pass it on, that the chain of transmission was broken at some point in the last century in ways that cannot be repaired. This is a real and painful loss, and acknowledging it is part of being honest about what the colonial period cost. But the broad outlines survive. The knowledge that the places exist, that they have the characteristics they have, that they were made in the way they were made, and used for the purposes they were used for, this has survived. And the people who hold it are willing, in some contexts, and with appropriate relationships, to share enough of it to make the investigation possible. The relationship between the communities that hold this knowledge and the institutions that have the technical capacity to investigate it has been, for most of the history of Canadian archaeology, a relationship characterized by extraction and disrespect. The institutions took what they wanted from the communities and gave very little back. The communities learned, through painful experience, that sharing knowledge with academic researchers generally meant seeing that knowledge appear in publications that did not acknowledge the community's intellectual ownership of it, and did not result in any benefit to the communities, and sometimes resulted in harm. This history is why the knowledge of the underground places is not widely shared, and why the investigation that could confirm what the accounts suggest has not happened. But the history is not fixed. It is changing, slowly and unevenly, but changing. The legal framework of Indigenous rights in Canada has been transformed over the last 30 years in ways that give Indigenous communities significantly more control over what happens on their traditional territories. The ethical framework of archaeological research has changed significantly as well, with the principle of community consent and partnership becoming increasingly standard rather than exceptional. And the broader social context in Canada, in the aftermath of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the ongoing national reckoning with the history of colonialism, is one in which the question of what Indigenous peoples have known about the landscape and what has been done to suppress or ignore that knowledge is a live, political and moral issue in a way it was not previously. This does not mean that the investigation of the underground places will happen tomorrow. It does not mean that the communities will suddenly become willing to share information that they have good reasons to protect. It does not mean that the institutions will suddenly be able to provide the resources and the partnership structures that the investigation would require. But it does mean that the conditions under which such an investigation might become possible are better now than they have been at any previous point in Canadian history. And that is worth something. It is worth quite a lot, actually, when you consider how long the knowledge has been waiting for the conditions to be right. The steps go down. They have been going down for a very long time, and the darkness at the bottom is not empty. It is full of what has been kept there, maintained by the community that knows the going down way, waiting for the question that is finally ready to be asked, and the partnership that is finally ready to be built. The shield is patient, the knowledge is patient. And patience, when what you are waiting for is justice and recognition, and the restoration of a history that was never lost but only hidden, is not resignation, it is faith. The faith of people who know that what is true does not stop being true because it has not been acknowledged. That what is there does not stop being there because no one is looking. That the stone holds what it holds, and the traditions hold what they hold, and the truth holds itself, through everything, until the moment when everything changes, and the real history of this country can finally be told. That is the promise of the staircases beneath Canada, not a sensational discovery, not a headline, not a documentary crew standing in front of carved steps with torches. but the promise of a fuller account of who was here and what they built and what they knew and how long they knew it. The promise of a history that is as deep as the rock itself, as patient as stone, as old as the going down way. The promise that what has been kept in the keeping places will one day be brought back to the surface, not to be extracted and taken and filed in the wrong category, but to be returned to the light in a way that honors the tradition that held it, and the people who maintained it, and the understanding of the landscape that it embodies. We are not there yet, but we are closer than we were, and the rock, as I said, is patient. Let the night hold you now. The shield is above you and below you and around you, 3 billion years old, patient beyond any scale you can comfortably imagine. The spruce trees are quiet. The tannin-dark creeks are finding their way through the rock in the dark. Somewhere, in a place that the people who know it would not point to on a map, the steps descend into the earth, worn smooth, regular in rise, descending into a keeping dark. And somewhere on the surface, in a community whose name you probably do not know, in a language you probably do not speak, the tradition of that place is still alive, still being carried by the people who carry it, still waiting for the moment when carrying it can finally mean something beyond the private maintenance of what would otherwise be lost. Sleep now, dream of deep places, dream of the people who know the going down way, who have known it longer than any official history of this country acknowledges. Dream of the stone that holds its knowledge without apology, without complaint, in the patient dark below the roots of the spruce, below the tannin-dark creeks, below the logging roads and the construction cuts and the drilling programs that have been looking past it for 150 years. Dream of the questions that are finally being asked. And dream, if you can, of the answers that are already there, below, waiting in the keeping dark, patient as stone, ready for the moment when the world above is finally ready to come down and see. Good night. The staircase descends. The dark below holds what it holds, and the story of what that is, in its fullness, is still being found. There is one more thread in this story that I want to follow before the night fully closes in, and it concerns the relationship between the underground places and the broader landscape of which they are a part. Because the staircases do not exist in isolation. They are not random holes in the ground cut by people who happen to be in the area and decided to go down. They exist in relationship to specific features of the surface landscape, to waterways and ridgelines and outcrops of specific rock types, and places where the geology changes in ways that would have been significant to people who understood the shield in the way the peoples of this region have always understood it. And understanding that relationship, even incompletely, illuminates something important about the purpose and the nature of the going down way. The Canadian shield is not uniform. It is a mosaic of different rock types, different fracture patterns, different relationships to water and ice, and the long processes of geological change. Within this mosaic, certain locations have characteristics that distinguish them from the surrounding terrain in ways that would have been obvious to people who spent their lives reading the landscape. Places where specific minerals outcrop, places where fault lines bring two different rock types into contact, places where underground water creates specific patterns of flow and seepage, places where the acoustic properties of the terrain create unusual effects, echo zones, zones of unusual quiet, places where sound carries in unexpected directions. These characteristics are not incidental to the oral traditions of the Shield peoples. They are central to them. The traditions of virtually every nation whose territory includes any part of the Shield contain detailed accounts of the landscape's specific properties, accounts that encode information about where specific things can be found, where specific kinds of activity are appropriate, where the relationship between the human and the non-human world has a particular quality or intensity. This is not metaphor, or not only metaphor. It is a sophisticated reading of the physical landscape encoded in cultural forms that make it transmissible across generations. The underground places, the descents with their smooth-edged steps and their absence of glacial till and their unusual acoustic qualities are embedded in this landscape reading. They are located, in the accounts, at places that have the kind of significance that the traditions recognize as significant. Not arbitrary locations chosen for convenience, but locations that the landscape itself, in its specific physical properties, marks as places worth attending to. The fissure in the Nipigon country is above a river drainage that the Anishinaabe tradition identifies as a corridor of movement, a place where the energy of the landscape flows in a specific direction. The location in northern Saskatchewan that the 1,952 pipeline crew encountered is in a section of the province where the shield meets the sedimentary geology of the Western Canadian Plains, a geological contact zone that in many Indigenous traditions is a place of special significance, a place where two different kinds of country touch. This geographic specificity in the accounts is itself evidence of something. Random inventions or misidentifications would not cluster at the kinds of locations that the oral traditions identify as significant. The accounts cluster there because the features cluster there, and the features cluster there because the people who made them were responding to the same properties of the landscape that the oral traditions encode. They were doing what the Anishinaabe elder described, following what was in the rock, finishing what the rock had begun, in the places where the rock was ready to be finished. The relationship between underground features and specific surface landscape properties has been documented in several other archaeological contexts, and the pattern is consistent. The painted caves of France and Spain are not distributed randomly across the landscape. They are concentrated in specific geological zones, where limestone karst provides both the cavity and the acoustic properties that the tradition required. The underwater hunting structures of Lake Huron are located at specific points in the lake's geography, where the submerged landscape creates natural bottlenecks in animal movement. The megalithic monuments of the British Isles are sited at locations that the geological and geographical surveys of those monuments consistently show to be unusual in their acoustic or hydrological or astronomical properties. The people who made these things were not just going underground. They were going underground at the right places, the places where the underground had the properties that their purposes required. And finding those places required a knowledge of the landscape that was not just observational but deeply relational, a knowledge built up over generations of attentive engagement with the specific terrain and refined through a tradition of practice that understood what the underground could offer and what the surface could not. This relational knowledge of the landscape is exactly what the oral traditions of the Shield peoples encode, and it is exactly what was lost, or rather suppressed, in the colonial understanding of the Shield as empty wilderness to be mapped and exploited. When the colonial framework looked at the Shield, it saw geology and resources and obstacles to transportation. When the people who had lived there for thousands of years looked at the same landscape, they saw a complex system of relationships and significances, a system they had been developing and refining and transmitting for as long as they had been there. The colonial framework could not see this system, but the system was there, and part of what it held, part of what it encoded and maintained, was the knowledge of where the going down way was and how to follow it. This is what the staircases beneath Canada ultimately represent, in the fullest sense, not just an archaeological anomaly, not just evidence of pre-contact stone construction, but evidence of a relationship between people and landscape that is older and deeper and more sophisticated than the official history of this country has acknowledged, a relationship that produced real physical features in the rock that maintained those features over very long periods of time through deliberate human activity, and that is still alive in the traditions of the peoples who built it and used it and never entirely stopped knowing about it. The history of Canada that acknowledges this relationship is not a smaller history than the one that ignores it. It is a larger one. It is a history that begins not 500 years ago with the arrival of Europeans, but tens of thousands of years ago with the arrival of the first people, whoever they were and wherever they came from, who looked at the Shield and began the long process of learning to read it and respond to it and build within it the infrastructure of their relationship to it. A history that includes the underground places and the oral traditions that describe them and the documentary accounts of the people who stumbled across them without understanding what they were seeing. A history that is still being made, still being contested, still being hidden and found and hidden again, still waiting for the moment when the full account can be given. The steps go down, the dark below holds what it holds, and somewhere in the rock of the Canadian Shield, in the cold and the quiet and the ancient mineral smell that Aldous Hearn noticed and wrote down in his private journal and then could not categorize, the most important part of the history of this country is still waiting to be found by the people who are ready to look for it, with the seriousness and the honesty and the respect that the landscape and the traditions and the evidence all demand. There is a phrase in the Anishinaabe tradition, used in the context of teaching about the landscape and the knowledge it carries, that translates something like, "The ground remembers everything that has stood on it." It is not a mystical claim, it is a practical one. The ground does remember, not in the way that human memory works, not as a mental record that can be accessed at will, but as a physical record, a record in the shape of the rock and the pattern of the fractures and the wear of the surfaces and the absence of what should be present and the presence of what should be absent. The ground remembers everything that has stood on it, including the people who cut the steps, including the feet that wore the edges smooth, including all the descents, across all the years, of all the people who knew the going down way. That memory is still there. It is in the rock. It is durable beyond any other kind of human record. And the traditions of the people who made it are also still there, maintained with a care and a commitment that is its own kind of testimony to the significance of what is being maintained. The two memories, the memory in the rock and the memory in the tradition, are waiting for the moment when they can be brought together, confirmed against each other, and told to the world in a way that the world is finally ready to hear. I do not know when that moment will come. I do not know whether it will be in the next decade or the next generation or some longer span of time that neither of us will live to see. The shield is patient and the traditions are patient, and the waiting has already been very long. But the waiting is not without direction. The question is being asked more seriously now than it has been before. The tools for asking it, both the technical tools of geophysical investigation and the social and political tools of genuinely collaborative research, are better now than they have been before. The relationship between the communities that hold the knowledge and the institutions that have the investigative capacity is not good, but it is better than it was, and it is moving, unevenly and incompletely, in the right direction. The stories will come. The full account of what is beneath the surface of Canada will emerge, in its own time, in the way that things emerge when the ground is finally ready, and the people are finally ready, and the question is finally being asked, in a way that allows the answer to be heard. And when it does, it will be a richer account than anything the official history has been able to tell. It will be a history in stone and in tradition, and in the careful documentary record of people who saw what they saw and wrote it down and could not think of what category to put it in. It will be the history of the going down way, told in full from the beginning. That is a story worth waiting for. The shield is waiting for it. The traditions are waiting for it. And now, somewhere in the small hours of whatever time it is where you are, with the sound of your breathing slowing and the darkness of your room settling around you, you can wait for it too. Not with any urgency. The stone does not know urgency. With the patience that deep time teaches. With the confidence that what is true will eventually find its way to the surface, as everything does, given enough time and enough pressure from below. The steps are still there. The dark below them holds what it holds. And the story of what is there, in all its fullness and complexity and challenge to everything the official history of this country has said, is waiting, as it has been waiting, as it will wait, if it must, for however much longer it takes. Because what is true does not stop being true in the dark. It waits there, patient as granite, patient as the 3-billion-year-old rock of the Canadian Shield, patient as the traditions of the people who have known it all along. Sleep well. Let the rock hold you. Let the traditions that have been maintained with such care, across such distances of time and pain, remind you that what has been lost can sometimes be found again, and that the finding, when it comes, is worth all the waiting that preceded it. The staircase descends. The dark below holds what it holds, and the story, when it is finally told in full, will be worth waking up for. Good night. In the early spring of 1894, a woman named Harriet Dunmore wrote a letter to her sister in England from a settlement near what is now North Bay, Ontario. The letter is in a private family collection and was shared with a researcher in the 1990s by Dunmore's great-granddaughter. It is a letter about ordinary things for the most part, about the difficulty of the winter just past and the state of the garden and the health of her children. But in the middle of it, almost as a parenthetical, Harriet Dunmore mentions that her husband, who worked as a contractor for one of the railway companies, then laying track through the Shield country north of Georgian Bay, had come home the previous week, very disturbed about something he had seen in a rock cutting. She writes that he described finding, in a section of freshly blasted rock, an opening that led to a space inside the rock that contained steps going down. She writes that he described the steps as cut, not natural, and that he was troubled by the fact that he could not explain them. She says that he told the supervisor, who looked at the opening, and said that it was a geological curiosity of no practical concern, and that the crew sealed it up with rubble to keep the cutting stable and moved on. Harriet Dunmore does not give a precise location. She gives a direction north of the Georgian Bay settlements, which could cover a considerable area, but she gives a name for the railway project, and the name narrows the geographic range to a specific section of Shield country that was being actively developed in the early 1890s. The cutting is probably beneath several feet of railway fill now, or beneath the railway bed itself, sealed not by deliberate concealment, but by the simple fact that it was sealed up with rubble in 1894, and the railway was built on top of it. But it was there, and Harriet Dunmore wrote about it to her sister, matter-of-factly, almost in passing, as if the finding of a constructed staircase in a freshly blasted section of Canadian Shield rock was the kind of thing that happened in this country, and that one noted but did not make a great fuss about. That casualness is its own kind of evidence. She was not describing a discovery that she thought of as extraordinary. She was describing something that her husband found and was troubled by, but that his supervisor had already decided was not worth stopping for. The supervisor's response, a geological curiosity of no practical concern, is the most concise version I have found of the institutional reflex I described earlier, the immediate categorization of the anomalous as natural and therefore not requiring further investigation. In the context of 1894, with a railway to build and a schedule to keep, the reflex was understandable, but its consequence was the permanent sealing of a feature that, if properly documented before being sealed, might have provided exactly the kind of evidence that the investigation still needs. The invisibility of these features, their constant discovery and resealing and reforgetting, is not a conspiracy. It is a process, distributed across hundreds of individual encounters over 150 years, each one the result of a small, institutional or personal decision that was rational in its local context and that collectively produced a pattern of systematic erasure. No one person decided to hide the staircases of the Canadian Shield. The hiding happened because the features were encountered in contexts where the only available framework for evaluating them said they should not be there, and where the institutional and personal pressures were all in the direction of finding an explanation that allowed work to continue rather than one that required work to stop. This is how the most important historical evidence in Canada has been handled, not through malice, but through a combination of institutional inertia, professional conservatism, and the sheer practical pressure of other things that needed doing. And the cumulative effect, after 150 years, is that the official record contains almost nothing about these features, while the landscape below the surface of Canada contains, almost certainly, the physical evidence of a history that would transform the official account of this country's past. The transformation would not be comfortable. It would require a rethinking not just of the archaeological timeline, but of the broader narrative of Indigenous history in Canada, a narrative that has been used, in various forms, to justify the colonial dispossession of Indigenous lands and peoples. If the peoples of the Canadian Shield were, as the evidence suggests, engaged in sophisticated stone construction and underground architecture over a very long period, then the colonial characterization of the land as wilderness and its peoples as nomadic and without permanent attachment to it is not just historically inaccurate, it is precisely and specifically false about the things it claims to know. The land was not wilderness. The peoples were not without architecture. The attachment was not impermanent. The evidence of all three is in the rock, available to anyone who goes underground and looks. This is one of the reasons why the investigation of the underground places is not just an archaeological question. It is a political and historical question, one that bears directly on the ongoing legal and political contests over Indigenous land rights in Canada. The recognition that Indigenous peoples built permanent stone features in the Shield, maintained them over long periods, embedded them in sophisticated traditions of knowledge and practice that constitute a relationship to the land every bit as substantial as the property relationships that European law recognizes, would be directly relevant to those contests. It would not resolve them. The law is complicated, and the history is complicated, and the politics are complicated, but it would provide a different kind of foundation for them, a physical, demonstrable foundation that is harder to dismiss than the oral traditions alone. The people who hold those oral traditions know this, and it is another layer of the complicated calculation about what to share and when and with whom. The knowledge of the underground places is not just culturally significant. It is potentially legally and politically significant. It is potentially a form of evidence in processes that have real material consequences for living communities. And the decision about how and whether to introduce it into those processes is not one that outsiders can make or should make. It belongs to the communities, and it will be made in the community's own time and in the community's own way. All of this is to say that the story of the staircases beneath Canada is much larger than the staircases themselves. They are the visible tip, or rather the invisible tip, of an inquiry that reaches into the deepest questions about this country's history and identity and relationship with the peoples who have been here longest. They are a place where the geological record and the oral tradition and the documentary archive and the political history all converge on the same question. And the question, asked simply, is this: what has been here, and for how long, and what does it mean that we have spent 150 years looking away from the answer? I do not know the full answer to that question, neither does anyone else yet, but the direction of the answer is becoming clearer. It is becoming clearer through the work of the researchers who are asking the right questions in the right partnerships, through the continued vitality of the oral traditions that have maintained the knowledge against all odds, through the documents that were filed in the wrong categories and forgot about and survived to be found, through the letters that were written by people who saw what they saw and could not think of what category to put it in but wrote it down anyway, because writing it down was what you did when something mattered. Harriet Dunmore wrote it down, Aldous Hearn wrote it down, Douglas Emmett and Frederick Coulter and Henry Whitmore and Frank Delaney and Thomas Breckinridge and the geologist from the Nunavut drilling program who wrote to her colleague about the percussion marks at 60 feet depth. They all wrote it down, and what they wrote has been waiting in archives and private collections and institutional files for the moment when someone comes looking with the right questions and the right framework and the right commitment to finding out what is actually there rather than confirming what is supposed to be there. The moment is arriving, not fully, not decisively, but arriving. The shield is patient, the traditions are patient, the letters in the archives are very patient, and the steps are still there, wherever they are, in the dark below the spruce, waiting. Now let the night hold the rest. You have been underground long enough for one sitting. The surface world is still there, with its ordinary light and its ordinary sounds, and its history that begins in the wrong place and ends before it has fully started. But below it, the real history is keeping its records in a medium that outlasts everything else. Stone, cold, quiet, patient, full. Come back someday. Ask the right questions. Find the right people to ask them with. Go down in the right way, the way that was prepared for those who know what they are looking for and why it matters. The going down way is still there, and at the bottom of it is everything the official history of this country has not yet found the courage to face. Sleep now. The ground is patient, the traditions are patient, and the story, when it is fully told, will be worth every year of the waiting. Good night. The question of what precisely is at the bottom of these descents, what the keeping places actually contain, is one I have been circling around throughout this account without directly addressing, and I want to address it now, in the last stretch of this journey, not with an answer that I do not have, but with an honest account of what the sources suggest and what the limits of current knowledge allow us to say. The oral traditions, as I have described them, tend to speak of the underground places in terms of what is held there rather than specific objects. The Cree concept of keeping, the Anishinaabe description of what was placed there for safety, the Haudenosaunee account of the thinning of the world, the Nalaka Pamuk's description of receiving and returning. None of these specifically describe objects or materials in the way that an archaeologist might want to know about. They describe a kind of relationship, a kind of activity, a kind of purpose. The underground places were where what needed to be kept was kept. But there are details in some of the accounts that point towards something more specific. The elder, quoted by Margaret Fallow in 1937, who described the old ones going into the earth, the way water goes into the ground, also said, In a section of the account that Fallow noted carefully, but did not foreground, that what was taken down was sometimes brought back and sometimes was not, and that what was not brought back was not lost but changed, and that the change was the point. This is not a description of storage in the material sense, but it suggests that whatever went into the underground places did not always come out in the same form, and that the underground environment itself was understood as doing something to what was kept there. This is consistent with what we know about the properties of specific underground environments in the geological context of the shield. The temperature in underground spaces in the shield is stable year-round, roughly equal to the mean annual surface temperature at that latitude. The humidity is typically high and constant. The absence of light means the absence of the photochemical processes that degrade many organic materials on the surface. And some shield environments, particularly those associated with specific mineral deposits, have chemical properties that can actively preserve organic materials under the right conditions through processes of mineralization and desiccation to effectively arrest biological decay. An underground environment with stable temperature, stable humidity, darkness, and in some cases the right chemical conditions is, from a purely physical standpoint, an excellent place to preserve things that would otherwise decay on the surface. This is why naturally occurring caves have provided some of the most remarkable archaeological finds in history, objects that survived in the underground environment, while everything of comparable age, exposed to surface conditions, had long since dissolved. If people in the pre-contact Canadian Shield were deliberately using underground environments for preservation purposes, they would have been exploiting exactly these physical properties, and the things they preserved might still be there. This is speculative. We have not gone in and looked, but it is not irresponsibly speculative. The physical properties of underground shield environments that would make them suitable for preservation are documented. The oral tradition accounts of the underground places as places where what needed to be kept was kept are documented. The absence of glacial till in several of the described features, which suggests active maintenance over very long periods, is documented in the accounts of observers who had no reason to fabricate that detail. These three strands of evidence are consistent with each other and with a hypothesis that is at least worth taking seriously, that the underground places of the Canadian Shield may contain preserved materials, objects or substances or documents in some medium that is not paper, that have survived precisely because they were underground, and precisely because someone made sure they stayed underground. The history of accidental archaeological discoveries in Canada, when construction or mining or other ground-disturbing work encounters pre-contact materials unexpectedly, is a history that contains some remarkable finds, alongside a far larger number of cases in which the find was not documented before it was destroyed. The record of what has been found and then lost, seen and then built over, noted and then filed in the wrong category and forgotten, is at least as long as the record of what has been properly preserved and studied. And the underground places, if they contain what the oral traditions suggest they contain, represent the largest single category of undocumented and uninvestigated pre-contact heritage in Canada. The scale of what might be there is difficult to estimate. The accounts, taken together, suggest features distributed across a geographic range covering most of northern Canada. The oral traditions suggest that the underground places were numerous, that many communities had access to their own local examples, that the network of these places was extensive. If even a fraction of the suggested distribution is real, and even a fraction of those features contain preserved materials, the amount of pre-contact heritage potentially held underground in Canada is significant. Not in a sensational lost treasure way, in a historical record way, the kind of record that would require a complete rewriting of the official account of this continent's past. And that is why the question has not been properly asked. The implications of the answer are too large, too disruptive, too politically and culturally significant for the current framework to comfortably handle. This is not a new situation in the history of archaeology. The discovery that the peopling of America was much earlier and much more complex than the Clovis first model allowed was resisted fiercely for decades, partly because of the evidence problems, but partly because the implications of a pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas were uncomfortable for a framework that had been built on the assumption of relative recency. The Bluefish Caves were controversial for years before they were accepted. Monteverde was rejected and then accepted, and is still contested at its earlier dates. The underwater structures of Lake Huron were initially met with skepticism that was not entirely explained by the evidence itself. The pattern is familiar. Significant findings that disrupt the official framework are resisted, not always on purely evidentiary grounds, but because the implications extend beyond the evidence itself into the territory of the narratives that the framework supports. And in the Canadian case, the narrative that the framework supports, the narrative of a land that was essentially wilderness before European contact, of peoples who were nomadic and temporary and without the kind of permanent relationship to the land that would make land rights claims substantial, is a narrative with very direct and very significant political consequences. The resistance to evidence that disrupts this narrative is not simply academic conservatism. It is also, at some level, a defense of a particular account of who this country belongs to. That is too large a claim to make without acknowledging its limits. Most of the individual researchers who have questioned or dismissed specific accounts of underground features were probably not thinking about land rights. They were thinking about the evidence in front of them and the frameworks they had been trained to use. The institutional inertia that keeps the question from being properly investigated is not, in most of its specific expressions, a politically motivated conspiracy. It is the normal operation of institutions that are not designed to accommodate anomalous information, but the aggregate effect has political dimensions, whether or not the individual acts within the aggregate are politically motivated. And acknowledging those political dimensions is part of being honest about why this question has been so consistently avoided. The stakes are high, the implications are large, and the people whose communities and traditions are most directly affected by the question are also the people whose knowledge is most essential to answering it, which means that the question cannot be answered properly without first addressing the relationship between those communities and the institutions that have historically exploited and dismissed them. This is where the story loops back to its own beginning. The staircases beneath Canada are a historical question and an archaeological question and a geological question, but they are also a political question and a moral question about the relationship between knowledge and power, about whose knowledge counts and whose does not, about what we owe to the people who have maintained the knowledge of this landscape through everything the colonial period threw at them. The answer to the historical question cannot be found without first getting much better at answering the political and moral questions. And the political and moral questions are being answered, imperfectly, slowly, but they are being answered, in the processes of reconciliation and the evolution of research ethics, and the growing recognition that the oral traditions of indigenous peoples are not background color for the main story, but the main story itself. The steps are still going down, the keeping dark is still holding what it holds. And the story of what is there is the story of Canada that has not yet been told. The story that begins not 500 years ago, but 50,000 years ago or more, not with the arrival of Europeans, but with the arrival of the people who looked at the shield and saw in it not an obstacle or a resource, but a partner, a landscape that had properties and purposes, and a kind of memory that made it possible to build a relationship with it that lasted, and still lasts, across a span of time that makes the entire European presence in North America look like a brief and recent episode in a very long story. That story is the real history of Canada, and some of its most important chapters are underground, waiting. I will leave you there, in the dark, in the patience of stone, in the care of a tradition that has not forgotten what is kept below and why it matters. In the hope of a moment, coming, when the question is asked in a way that allows the full answer to be given, the staircase descends. Good night. Let me tell you about water, because water is woven through this entire story in ways I have touched but not fully traced, and the relationship between the underground places and the hydrology of the Canadian Shield is one of the most concrete and least mystical aspects of what makes these features significant. The Shield is full of water. It always has been. The rock is fractured in ways that create innumerable channels and reservoirs and flows that operate below the surface, invisible from above, moving through the geology of the continent in patterns that are only partially understood even now. And the relationship between these flows of water and the carved descents is one that appears, consistently, in both the documentary accounts and the oral traditions, in ways that suggest that part of what the people who made these places understood was where the underground water was and how it moved. The Mi'kmaq elders' account of steps that descended to where the shore used to be is partly a story about sea level change, as I described earlier. But it is also a story about water, about the relationship between the underground space and the water table, about a descent that led to a place where water was accessible in a specific form or from a specific source. The Anishinaabe tradition's emphasis on the underground places as paths that follow what was already in the rock includes references, in some versions of the tradition, to following the path that water knows, following the line that water would take if it could. And this phrase, the line that water would take, is not just poetic, it is technically precise. The natural fracture lines in shield rock follow paths determined partly by the differential weaknesses in the rock and partly by the movement of water through those weaknesses over millions of years. A carved staircase that follows the grain of the rock, finishing what the rock had begun, would naturally follow the same lines that water follows. The steps and the water would share the same path. This has practical implications. Underground spaces associated with groundwater flow maintain specific temperature and humidity conditions. They can be used as sources of water in times of surface scarcity. They can be used for specific preservation conditions, as I described earlier, and they can be used as indicators of where underground water is moving in ways that are relevant to the surface knowledge of the landscape, to understanding the hydrology that feeds the springs and the rivers and the lakes that the surface communities depended on. The people of the Shield were sophisticated hydrologists in the practical sense that their lives depended on understanding water, where it was going, what it was doing underground before it emerged on the surface. The underground places, if they were located and used in relationship to significant underground water features, would have been part of this hydrological knowledge, part of the system of understanding water's movements and sources that the tradition maintained. There is a detail in the 1912 mining survey report by Douglas Emmett that I mentioned earlier but did not fully explore. Emmett noted not only the absence of glacial till in the cavity he described, but also the presence of what he called a seep, a slow movement of water through one wall of the cavity at a consistent rate. He noted this as a potential concern for the mining operation, since seeping water can indicate proximity to significant underground water features that could cause problems for excavation. But in the context of this account, the seep is significant for a different reason. It suggests that the cavity was located at a point where underground water movement was accessible, where the relationship between the carved space and the underground hydrology was not accidental. The cavity was not just below the surface. It was at a specific point in the underground water system, a point that would have been identifiable to people who understood how water moved through the Shield. The knowledge of underground water in the Canadian Shield is one of the most detailed bodies of geological knowledge that the oral traditions encode. It is knowledge that was economically essential, that determined where communities could travel safely in different seasons, where water could be found in drought conditions, where ice was reliable, and where it was not. This knowledge is encoded in the traditions, not as abstract geological information, but as relational knowledge, knowledge of specific places and specific conditions and specific times when the water did what it did. And the underground places, the carved descents, the going down ways, are embedded in this knowledge as places where the relationship between the human community and the underground water was most direct. I want to follow this thread into one more account before I let it go, an account from a source that is different from the ones I have described so far. In 1967, a group of high school students on a field trip in the Shield country of Northern Ontario, under the supervision of a geology teacher named Richard Farrow, entered a natural cave on the shore of a small lake. Farrow wrote about the experience in a letter to a colleague at another school, a letter that the colleague preserved, and that eventually came to the attention of a researcher working on anomalous underground features in the Shield in the 1990s. The letter describes the cave as a natural feature in limestone near the lakeshore, accessible through a low entrance at water level. Inside the cave, Farrow writes, the students found a section that was clearly not natural, a corridor, he calls it, that ran back into the rock at an angle and that had regular, cut surfaces on its floor, surfaces that Farrow describes as steps in every respect, except that he did not want to use that word in a letter to a colleague because of how it would sound. Farrow was a geology teacher. He understood natural cave formation processes. He was aware of the ways that differential weathering and water erosion could produce regular-looking features in soluble rock. He had spent time in caves and understood their visual properties, and he was writing in a tone that is careful, self-aware, slightly embarrassed by what he was describing, as if he knew that it was going to sound extraordinary and was not certain how to present it without sounding like someone who had lost their professional judgment. But he wrote it. He wrote that the steps, or the step-like surfaces, were regular in a way that was inconsistent with any natural process he could account for, and that the corridor they formed led back and down into the rock in a way that was clearly different from the natural cave passage from which it branched. The students apparently explored it for about 50 feet, Farrow writes, before the corridor became too low for them to continue easily, and the limited light of their equipment made further exploration inadvisable. They came back out. They did not tell anyone in authority, because Farrow told them not to, fearing the complications it would create for the school board. And Farrow wrote his letter to his colleague, and his colleague kept it, and the researcher found it 20 years later, and now I am telling you about it, which is another step in the long chain of accidental preservation through which the unofficial record of these features has accumulated. What strikes me about Farrow's account, as with so many of the others, is not primarily the specific detail of what he describes. It is the tone, the careful self-monitoring, the awareness of how it will sound, the choice to not use the word steps even though the word clearly applies, the decision to keep it quiet because of the complications it would create. This is not the tone of a fraud or a fantasist. It is the tone of a professional who has seen something he cannot explain within his professional framework and who is navigating the very real social and institutional pressures that come with being a professional who sees things that cannot be explained. The pressures say, keep quiet, file it away, tell someone you trust in a letter, but do not make it official. And so he did, and so the knowledge was preserved, not in any official record, but in the chain of trust and care that has maintained so much of the unofficial knowledge of these features across so much time. The chain of trust and care is itself one of the things this story is about. It is the same chain that maintains the oral traditions of the Anishinaabe and the Cree and the Haudenosaunee and the Mi'kmaq. It is the same chain that led Harriet Dunmore's great-granddaughter to share her ancestor's letter with a researcher a century after it was written. It is the chain through which the geologist who wrote about the percussion marks in the Nunavut drill core sent a private letter to a colleague rather than letting the knowledge disappear entirely. The chain is fragile. It has many weak links. Many of its most important connections have been broken, but it has not been broken entirely. And what remains in it, the accumulated unofficial knowledge of the underground places of Canada, is the foundation on which the real investigation, when it comes, will have to build. The investigation will need to combine multiple kinds of knowledge and multiple kinds of expertise. It will need the technical capacity to investigate underground features using modern geophysical methods, to identify the exact locations where the anomalies are most clearly indicated, and to characterize their properties from the surface before any ground disturbance. It will need the geological expertise to understand what the natural processes in the relevant rock types actually produce, so that the line between natural and constructed can be drawn with confidence rather than assumption. It will need the archaeological expertise to design and conduct excavations, if excavations become appropriate, in ways that preserve the maximum possible information. And it will need the knowledge of the communities whose oral traditions have been pointing at these places for as long as anyone can remember. Knowledge that is not just background context but primary evidence, the most detailed and most specifically located information available about where the features are and what they were used for. None of these kinds of expertise are unavailable. The technical capacity exists. The geological and archaeological expertise exists. The community knowledge exists in the communities that hold it. What does not yet exist, in sufficient measure, is the partnership structure that would allow these different kinds of knowledge to work together in a way that is genuinely collaborative rather than extractive. Building that structure is the work that needs to happen before the investigation can happen, and it is being worked on in specific communities and specific institutions and specific research relationships by people who understand what is at stake and who are committed to finding a way forward that respects all of the knowledge that is involved. I believe that work will succeed. I believe the investigation will happen. I believe the steps will be found, properly, formally, with the community partnership and the institutional support and the public documentation that will make the finding impossible to file away or explain away or seal up with rubble and build a railway on top of. I believe this not because I have evidence that it will happen, but because the trajectory of where the conversation is moving, combined with the increasing sophistication of the tools available for investigating underground features without destructive excavation, and the growing recognition in Canadian society of the importance of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous land rights, all point in a direction that makes this not just possible but, I think, eventual. The only question is timing. And timing, in the context of a story that is already thousands of years old, is not an urgent concern. The rock will wait. The traditions will wait. The letters in the archives will wait. The GPR anomalies identified in the 2019 paper will wait. The convergence of documentary and oral tradition evidence in the Nipigon country will wait. They have been waiting for a very long time already. A few more years, a decade, a generation, is not, in the scale of the shield, a very long additional wait. But it matters that the wait is not too long, because the things that are most at risk are not the physical features. Those are in rock, and rock is durable. What is at risk are the human carriers of the relevant knowledge, the elders who hold the most specific and most detailed knowledge of the underground places, the knowledge that is ceremonial and therefore not fully transferable through the normal channels of academic documentation, are not going to be here forever. The chain of transmission has already been weakened in ways that have caused real loss, and further delay means further loss. The urgency is not archaeological, it is human. It is the urgency of any situation where the people who carry essential knowledge are aging and the conditions for its transfer are not yet in place. This is the most pressing practical argument for the investigation to happen sooner rather than later. Not because the rock will decay, because the people who know where to look and what they are looking at may not always be there to tell us. The knowledge that is held in the rock is durable beyond any human lifespan. The knowledge that is held in the traditions is far more fragile, dependent on the health and continuity of the communities that maintain it and on the transmission relationships within those communities that carry it from one generation to the next. The communities are working on this. They know it better than any outside observer. The transmission of traditional knowledge about significant underground sites is not something that is going to be solved by academic research or documentary films or any process originating outside the communities themselves. It is an internal cultural and political project, one of the many dimensions of the larger project of cultural revitalization and continuity that Indigenous communities across Canada are engaged in. But the timing of the partnership with outside researchers and institutions is relevant to this internal project, and moving toward the partnership sooner means that the elders who hold the most detailed knowledge have more opportunity to be involved in a way that respects the full complexity of what they know. The rock is patient. The people are not infinitely patient. This is the tension at the heart of the inquiry, and it is the reason why the story I have been telling you tonight is not just history. It is also present tense, also urgent, also requiring action in the time that is available, which is not infinite. The steps are still there. The people who know what they are and why they matter are still here. And the moment when the two can be brought together properly, in a framework of genuine mutual respect and genuine partnership, is closer than it has ever been. That is the most hopeful thing I can say about a story that contains within it a great deal of loss and avoidance and missed opportunity. It is closer than it has ever been. And now let the night hold the rest of it. You have been patient in the darkness of this journey. You have followed the thread through the archives and the oral traditions and the private letters and the geological surveys and the field notes that were filed in the wrong categories and the Indigenous knowledge that was maintained. Against all odds, you have followed the going down way without going anywhere, which is its own kind of journey, and one that leaves you, I hope, with a sense of what is underground in this country that you did not have before you started listening. The world is larger than its official history. The ground beneath your feet is deeper than the maps acknowledge. The people who have known this land longest have known things about it that the colonial project tried very hard to erase, and the things they knew are still there, in the rock and in the traditions and in the careful chain of knowledge that has maintained what was most important, through everything that was thrown at it. The staircases are there, the going down way is still there, and the story of what is at the bottom of it is the story of what this country is capable of being when it is finally willing to go all the way down into its own truth. That is a journey for another day, perhaps many days. Tonight, let the dark hold you, let the stone hold its knowledge with its characteristic and absolute patience. Let the traditions hold their fire, careful and contained, against the moment when it is needed. And let yourself rest, here, at the surface of a country that has more below it than most people know, more history and more complexity, and more to account for than the official record has yet been willing to face. Sleep now. The ground is very old and very patient beneath you, and what it holds is not going anywhere. It is waiting, as it has always waited, for the right question, asked in the right way, by the right people, at the right moment. The moment is coming, the question is being asked, and the answer, when it arrives, will be worth everything that has been paid to reach it. Good night. The staircases descend. The darkness below holds what it holds, and the story of this country, in its fullness and its depth, is still being written in the most durable medium available, in the ancient patient stone of the Canadian Shield. Let me tell you one more thing before the night fully closes. A small thing, but a thing that has stayed with me since I first came across it, and that seems like the right note on which to let this particular inquiry rest. It comes from the ethnographic notes of a researcher named Clara Bishop, who spent 3 seasons in the early 1930s working with Cree communities in what is now Northern Ontario, documenting their oral traditions and their knowledge of the landscape. Bishop's notes are in the archives of a Canadian university and have never been fully published, though they have been cited occasionally in the literature on Cree oral tradition. In her notes from the 2nd season, Bishop records a conversation with an elder man she identifies only as Joseph because he asked her not to use his full name. Joseph was, by Bishop's estimate, in his 70s or 80s, which would place his birth in the 1850s or 1860s, within the first or second generation of Canadian Confederation and the beginning of the major settlement and resource extraction push into the Shield country. He had, Bishop writes, a very detailed knowledge of the landscape around his community's traditional territory, knowledge that extended well beyond what Bishop expected from the practical requirements of hunting and gathering and travel. At one point in their conversation, which Bishop was conducting through an interpreter, she asked Joseph whether there were places in the landscape that had been made by people, as opposed to places that were simply natural features. She was thinking of the surface, of campsites and fish weirs, and the kinds of modifications of the environment that would be visible to an observer moving through the territory. Joseph's answer, as Bishop records it in translation, was that everything in the landscape had been touched by people in one way or another, because people had been here for a very long time and had been paying attention. But then he said something that Bishop underlined in her notes, suggesting she recognized it as significant. He said that the most important things that people had made were the things that were not visible from above, and that those things were the things that lasted longest, because what you could not see could not be taken away. What you could not see could not be taken away. Bishop does not comment on this in her notes. She underlines it and moves on to the next topic. But the phrase has a quality that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. It is not a mystical statement. It is a practical one, and a political one. By the time Joseph was born, the dispossession of Indigenous lands in Canada was well underway. The taking away of things that could be seen, the territory, the resources, the surface world, was already happening and would intensify dramatically in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. In that context, the practical significance of making things that could not be seen, that were below the surface, that would not be visible to anyone not specifically looking for them in the specific way required to find them, is not hard to understand. But the statement also points back further than Joseph's own experience of colonialism, further than anything in the living memory of even the oldest elder he had learned from. It points back to the decision to make the underground places in the first place, to go to the considerable effort of cutting steps into granite and descending into the keeping dark, not just because it was useful, but because what is underground is safer than what is above. What cannot be seen cannot be taken away. What is in the rock cannot be demolished or burned or flooded or seized. It can only be forgotten, which is a different kind of loss, and one that the traditions were designed to prevent. Joseph was describing a strategy that may be as old as the underground places themselves. The decision to put what was most important below the surface, where it would be safe from whatever might come, is a decision that requires thinking about the future in a particular way. It requires imagining conditions under which the surface world would be hostile or dangerous or inadequate, conditions under which the most important things would need to be protected by being hidden in the most durable medium available. It requires thinking about what lasts and what does not, and concluding that the rock lasts longest of all, and that what is placed in the rock is as safe as anything in this world can be. This is not prophecy. It is not that the people who made the underground places foresaw the specific form of the colonial dispossession that would come thousands of years later, but it is a kind of wisdom about the fragility of the surface world and the durability of the underground one that turns out to have been, whatever its original motivation, exactly the right response to what eventually happened. What they put underground survived. What was on the surface did not always survive. The strategy worked, and the oral tradition, which is the above-ground equivalent of the underground keeping, the thing that cannot be seen by people who do not know where to look, has survived alongside the physical features, maintaining the knowledge of them through everything the colonial period could throw at it. What you could not see could not be taken away. The staircases could not be seen. The knowledge of them, maintained in the traditions of the communities that knew them, could not be seen by the colonial institutions that were looking for things to take. And so both have survived, the physical features and the knowledge of them, into a moment when the taking may be over and the finding can begin. That is the most complete summary I can offer of what this story is about. Not just the archaeological mystery of the staircases themselves, but the much larger story of a wisdom about the relationship between what is hidden and what survives, a wisdom that turned out to be exactly what was needed, and that is still, in this moment, holding what was placed in its care. The stone is patient, the traditions are patient, and what cannot be seen is still there, below the surface of a country that has not yet fully looked for it, waiting to be found by the people who are ready to look. Now truly let the night hold the rest. The spruce are quiet in the dark above the shield. The water is moving through the rock in its underground channels, finding its way as it always has. The steps are there, wherever they are, going down into the keeping dark. And what is kept there is kept, as Joseph said it would be, because what cannot be seen cannot be taken away. You cannot see it tonight, but you know it is there. And knowing it is there, knowing that the history of this country goes down as well as back, that it is deeper as well as older than the official account acknowledges, is a kind of knowing that changes how you stand on the ground you are standing on. Not dramatically, not with any special urgency, just with the quiet awareness that the surface is not the whole story, that the rock below has been holding its own account for a very long time, and that the account it holds, if we are patient enough and honest enough and willing enough to go looking in the right way with the right people, will turn out to be worth everything that has been spent to keep it. Sleep now. The stone holds, the traditions hold, the story holds. And when you wake, the ground will still be there beneath you, patient as it has always been, full of what it holds, waiting for the question that is finally ready to receive the full and honest answer. Good night. Now, before the darkness takes us completely, I want to place one final idea in the air between us. It is not a dramatic idea, it is a quiet one. It concerns the nature of what archaeology is, what it is actually for, and what the stakes are when it fails to account for something that is as present and as persistent and as well documented in its own way as the underground features of the Canadian Shield. Archaeology is, in its most ambitious version, the attempt to reconstruct the full human past from whatever evidence the past has left, not just the parts of the past that fit existing frameworks, not just the parts that confirm what we already think we know, the full past, including the parts that are inconvenient, and the parts that are strange, and the parts that require new categories to understand. The underground features of the Canadian Shield, the carved descents, and the keeping places, and the going down ways, described by 150 years of documentary accounts, and by the oral traditions of the peoples who have known about them since before anyone thought to write. Anything down are part of the full past. They are part of the human story in this part of the world, and the failure to investigate them, the systematic looking away that has characterized the institutional response to the evidence for their existence, is a failure of archaeology in its most ambitious sense. This is not a fatal failure. It is not too late to do better. The evidence is still there. The oral traditions are still alive. The documentary record is still accessible in the archives and private collections where the letters and field notes and survey reports have been patiently waiting. And the tools for doing better, the geophysical survey methods, and the ancient DNA analysis, and the principles of genuinely collaborative research that have been slowly developing in the field over the last few decades, are available and improving. The conditions for doing better are present. The will to do better is the thing that is still catching up. But the will is present too, in the individual researchers and the indigenous community members and the institutional administrators and the funding agencies that are slowly, unevenly, in fits and starts and false starts, moving toward a different kind of practice. A practice that takes the oral traditions seriously as primary evidence. A practice that designs research in partnership with the communities whose knowledge and heritage are at stake. A practice that publishes findings that disrupt the official framework without apologizing for disrupting it. A practice that treats the full human past as the legitimate subject of inquiry, even when the full human past is more complicated and more politically consequential than the current official version. That practice is the future of archaeology in Canada, if archaeology in Canada is going to be worth having. And the staircases beneath the shield, when they are finally properly investigated in that spirit and that partnership, will be one of its most significant contributions to the full account of what it means to be human in this particular landscape over this particular and very long span of time. Until then, the keeping dark keeps, the stone holds, the traditions hold, the letters in the wrong files wait for someone to come looking, the steps go down, and the story of what is at the bottom of them is the most important story that this country has not yet told about itself. Tonight you have heard the outline of it, the shape of it, the direction in which the full account lies. The rest is still underground, but it is there. And one day, in the right partnership and the right spirit, it will come to the light. Sleep well and dream of deep places. The night is very quiet over the Canadian Shield. The spruce trees have gone still. The tannin-dark creeks are finding their way between rocks in the dark. The stars, where the sky is clear enough to see them, are the same stars that have always been there. The same stars that the people who made the underground places watched from the surface between their descents. The same stars that old Peter would have known by name and by season and by the stories that his tradition attached to them. The ground beneath all of this is 3 billion years old in places. The knowledge of what is in it, maintained in the traditions of the peoples who have lived above it for as long as anyone can trace, is older than any European document. And the going down way is still there, worn smooth at the edges, descending into a keeping dark that has been holding what it holds without complaint or diminishment, through everything, patiently, until now. You are part of this too, not in any mystical sense, but in the simple sense that knowing about the underground places changes how you stand on the ground. It makes the surface thinner. It makes the depth below more present. It makes the history of this country feel like what it actually is, not a story that begins 500 years ago with the arrival of Europeans, but a story that begins at the beginning, whenever the beginning was, and that includes in its full account the people who went underground, and the places they went, and the things they kept there, and the traditions that have maintained the knowledge of all of this through everything that has tried to erase it. That is the gift of knowing, even partial knowing, even the incomplete, fragmented, inferred knowing that is all that is available right now. It makes the ground deeper, it makes the history longer, it makes the country more itself, more real, more present in the full complexity of what it actually is. Take that with you into the rest of the night. The stone is patient, the traditions are patient, the answer is there, below, waiting, and you now know, at least, that it is there to be found. Good night, sleep deep, dream of stairs descending into the patient dark of the oldest rock in the world. And when you wake, remember that the ground knows more than you do. It has been paying attention for a very long time. There is a landscape in northern Canada that I keep returning to in my thinking about this subject, not because it is the most spectacular or the most evidentially rich, but because it exemplifies something about the relationship between the surface and the underground that seems essential to everything else I have described. It is a low ridge above a river, in the Shield Country, somewhere between the Great Lakes and Hudson Bay, in the kind of terrain that most people pass through in vehicles without looking at closely. The spruce is dense there, The rock breaks through the surface in the way it does in shield country, irregular and grey-green with lichen, in outcrops that catch the light at certain hours and seem almost to glow. The river below runs dark and cold, and carries in it the particular mineral tang of water that has moved through ancient rock. If you stop there, if you get out of the vehicle and stand on the ridge, and let the landscape be present to you for a few minutes, without trying to do anything with it, you begin to notice things. The way the light falls differently in one section of the ridge than in the adjacent sections. The way sound travels in an unusual direction, not away from the river as you might expect, but toward a specific point on the ridge. The way certain plants grow in patterns that experienced plant people would recognize as indicating specific soil conditions below the surface, conditions that suggest different geological properties at depth than the surrounding terrain. None of these are dramatic. None of them announce themselves, but they are there, for anyone who has learned to read the landscape the way the people who have always lived here have learned to read it. The people who made the underground places in the Canadian Shield read the landscape this way. They did not encounter it as resource or obstacle or backdrop for human activity. They encountered it as the primary reality, the thing that everything else was in relation to, and their reading of it included the underground dimension, the knowledge of what was below the surface, and where the surface gave access to the below, and why that access mattered. This reading is what was at stake in the colonial encounter with the Shield. Not just the land in the legal and political sense, not just the resources in the economic sense, but the knowledge of the land, the deep relational knowledge that makes the surface intelligible as part of a larger whole that includes the underground dimension. When the colonial framework reduced the Shield to map coordinates and geological survey categories and resource extraction parcels, it did not just appropriate land, it suppressed a way of understanding the land that included the knowledge of the underground places, and with it, the physical features themselves, which became invisible to anyone who did not already know where to look. The restoration of this knowledge is not just an archaeological project, it is a cultural and philosophical project about what kind of understanding of landscape is possible and what is at stake in how we relate to the ground we stand on. The underground places of the Canadian Shield are evidence that a different kind of relationship is possible, that the ground can be known in its full depth rather than just its surface, that the knowledge of what is below can be maintained alongside the knowledge of what is above, that the two dimensions of the landscape can be held together in a unified understanding that does not reduce either to the other. This is not a romantic idea, it is a practical one. The people who maintained this knowledge did so because it was useful, because understanding the underground dimension of the landscape made their lives and their communities more sustainable and more resilient. The knowledge of where the underground water moved, where the keeping places were, where the going down way led, where the world thinned in ways that made specific kinds of practice possible, was not esoteric knowledge held by specialists for ceremonial purposes. It was part of the general competency of people who lived in relationship with the Shield over very long periods of time. The loss of this knowledge, or rather its suppression, and its maintenance, against great odds in the communities that still hold it, is one of the costs of the colonial period that is least visible in the standard accounts of what colonialism took. The territory is visible. The people's suffering is visible, increasingly and incompletely, but increasingly. The destruction of cultures and languages is visible, but the loss of specific knowledge about specific places in the landscape, the knowledge that tells you where the steps are and how to follow them and what they are for, this is not visible in any public accounting of what was taken. It is felt inside the communities, where the chain of transmission was broken, felt as specific absences, as specific things that should be known and are not known, because the person who knew them died before they could pass it on. But it is not part of the national conversation about the costs of colonialism. The underground places of the Canadian Shield are one way of making this cost visible, not by sensationalizing the mystery of what is underground, not by making the story about ancient secrets and hidden treasures, but by taking seriously the evidence for the existence of these places and the evidence for the knowledge system that created and maintained them, and by understanding the suppression of both as part of the same colonial project that is still being reckoned with in Canadian society and law. The staircases are not just archaeological evidence. They are evidence of a knowledge system, and the suppression of the evidence for the staircases is part of the suppression of the knowledge system that made them and that knows what they mean. This is why the investigation, when it comes, needs to be conducted the way the researchers who are working toward it understand it needs to be conducted. Not as an extraction of information from a landscape and a set of communities into the academic system, but as a restoration of visibility to something that was always there, always known to those who knew it, and suppressed not because it was false, but because acknowledging it was inconvenient for the frameworks and the politics that the colonial project required. The staircases descend, the keeping dark holds, and the story of what is kept there is the story of this land in its full depth and its full dignity, a story that has not yet been fully told, but that is closer to being tellable than it has ever been. Let that be enough for tonight. The night has been long, and the descent has been deep, and the questions that remain are worthy of the patience they require. You have gone as far as the available light will take us. The rest is still in the dark, waiting for a different kind of expedition. Sleep now. The ground holds you. The stone is patient. The traditions are alive. And the story, when it is fully told in the fullness of the partnership and the time that it requires, will be worth every moment of the long wait that preceded it. Good night. Dream of deep places. Dream of the patient dark below the roots of the spruce trees, above the tannin dark river in the Shield country that is older than almost anything else you can stand on. Dream of the steps going down. Dream of the people who made them, and the knowledge they maintained, and the things they kept safe in the rock, because what cannot be seen cannot be taken away. Dream of the moment when what is below comes to the surface, and the full account of this country's history can finally be told. Dream of that, and rest in the confidence that what is true does not stop being true in the dark, that what is in the rock does not diminish in the waiting, and that the story, patient as the shield itself, will be there when the light finally comes down to it. Good night. Sleep well. The staircase descends. The dark holds what it holds, and you, for a few hours at least, can hold what you have heard tonight and let it settle into whatever place in you it belongs. Good night. There are questions that come to rest in you rather than getting answered. Questions that do not resolve into conclusions, but that change how you move through the world by inhabiting a permanent corner of your awareness. The question of the underground places of Canada is one of those questions for me, and I think for some of the researchers who have spent time with the evidence, and for the community members who hold the knowledge of them, the question has been living in that corner for a very long time, not as a problem to be solved, but as a presence to be accounted for. The presence is this: there are places in the Canadian Shield where someone carved into granite, deliberately and with considerable skill, a series of regular surfaces descending into the earth. These surfaces are worn in ways that indicate long use. They lead to spaces that do not contain the geological deposits they should contain if they had simply been left alone by the glaciers. The spaces to which they lead have specific acoustic and chemical properties that distinguish them from random natural cavities. And the people whose ancestors knew these places best, whose oral traditions describe them in consistent and specific terms, have been maintaining that knowledge through conditions that would have been sufficient to destroy most other forms of cultural memory, because the places matter, and what is kept in them matters, and the knowledge of the going down way is not something that can be easily lost without losing something essential about the relationship between their communities and the landscape. This presence is not answered by saying that the features are natural. The accounts are too consistent and too numerous for that explanation to hold. It is not answered by saying that the oral traditions are metaphorical. The oral traditions describe physical features in physical terms, with geographic specificity and historical detail that metaphors do not require. It is not answered by saying that the investigation has not happened yet, and therefore we cannot say anything about what is there. The absence of formal investigation does not change what is in the ground or in the traditions. It only reflects the gap between what is known and what has been officially acknowledged. The presence asks something of us. It asks that we take seriously the possibility that the history of human activity in North America is significantly older and significantly more architecturally sophisticated than the official account allows. It asks that we take seriously the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Shield as primary evidence rather than background context. It asks that we build the partnerships and assemble the resources and develop the institutional will to investigate what the evidence suggests is there. And it asks that we be honest about why this has not happened sooner, about the role of colonial frameworks and political pressures and institutional inertia in maintaining a historical account that is more comfortable than it is complete. These are not comfortable things to ask, but the ground is not particularly interested in our comfort. It holds what it holds, with the complete indifference of very old stone to the preferences of the very temporary creatures standing on its surface. And what it holds, whatever it is real. It is there. The steps are there, worn smooth by the feet of people we do not yet fully understand, descending into a darkness that has held its knowledge with the patience of the most durable material in the world for a very long time. The moment of reckoning with this will come. When it does, it will change the official history of Canada in ways that are not yet fully imaginable, but that are, given the direction of the evidence, clearly overdue. The reckoning will be difficult. It will require honesty about the limits of the current framework and the costs of maintaining it. It will require genuine partnership with the communities whose knowledge has been the most important thing standing between the underground places and the complete forgetting of what they are. But it will also be something else. It will be a recognition that this country's history is deeper than its official account, that the people who have been here longest have known things about this land that the colonial project tried very hard to deny, that the landscape itself has been holding the evidence in the most reliable archive available and waiting with the patience of ancient stone for the moment when the people above it are ready to come and look. That moment is almost here. The questions are almost ready. The partnerships are almost built. The light is almost sufficient. And when it comes, when the investigation finally happens in the spirit and the partnership that it deserves, what is found underground will not be a surprise to the people who have always known it was there. It will be a confirmation, a formal recognition of what the traditions have always held, and the steps, worn smooth and regular and patient in the granite dark, will be exactly where the oral traditions said they were, waiting as they have always waited, as the stone itself has always waited, for the world above to be ready to receive what is kept below. The night deepens. The shield settles into its 3 billion-year patience beneath the surface of a country that has not yet learned to read itself fully. The spruce are still. The creeks are still. The stars are moving in their slow course above the ridge, where the cleft opens and the steps go down. And in communities across the shield, in languages that predate the country that now claims the territory, the knowledge of the going down way is still alive, still being held, still being carried forward with the care and the commitment that marks what cannot be allowed to be lost. That care is not invisible to those who know how to see it, and it is not wasted. What has been maintained at such cost and with such dedication across such a span of time and such a weight of disruption will turn out to have been worth maintaining. The stone knows this already. The stone has always known. And in the quiet patience of the keeping dark, where what has been most important was placed for safekeeping by people who understood what lasts and what does not, the most important chapter of this country's history is waiting to be told. Good night. The staircase goes down, the dark holds, the stone is patient, and the story, when it is fully told, will be worth every moment of the waiting that preceded it. Sleep now. Let the ground carry what it carries. Let the traditions carry what they carry. Let the night carry the rest of it, patiently, as it always has. And when morning comes, and the light returns to the surface of the world, know that the depth below the surface is still there, still patient, still holding, still waiting for the full accounting that this country owes to the full history of this land. Good night. Dream of deep things. Dream of the going down way, and the people who knew it, and the stone that holds its record without apology. Dream of the moment when the reckoning comes, and the steps are found, and the story can finally be told in full. Dream of that, and rest. The stone will keep, the traditions will keep, and the story, patient as granite, will be there when you come looking. Good night. There is one last thing the shield asks of us, and it is the simplest thing it has asked all night. It asks only that we remember, not in the sense of memorizing facts or storing information, in the deeper sense of remembering that the world is older and deeper and more various than the frameworks we use to understand it can fully hold. The official history of Canada has done its best with the tools available to it, and it has produced an account that is coherent and detailed and true within the limits of what it was willing to look at. But it stopped short of the full depth. It went down to a certain level and then turned back, because what was below that level was uncomfortable or inconvenient, or simply outside the categories available to it. The full depth is still there. It was never filled in or smoothed over. It was only not looked at. And the steps that lead to it, the going down way, is still there too, cut into the stone by people who understood that some things need to be accessed from below, that the most important part of any landscape is often the part you cannot see from the surface. The stone holds, the traditions hold, and the night, patient as both, holds everything else. Sleep now. You have gone as far as the available light will take us tonight. The rest is in the dark, waiting for the investigation it deserves, and the partnership that will make it possible, and the honesty that will make it meaningful when it comes. The staircase descends. The dark below holds what it holds. And the history of this country, in its full depth and its full truth, is waiting below the surface, patient as the stone it is written in, ready for the moment when the world above is finally prepared to come down and read it. Good night. The light that exists underground is not the light of the surface world. It is not sunlight or moonlight or the reflected glow of anything above. It is the light you bring with you, the light of fire or oil, or the small electric beam of a flashlight pointed into a darkness that has not seen any light at all since the last person was here. When you bring your light underground, it illuminates only what is immediately around it. The rest remains dark. And this relationship between the small circle of light and the enormous surrounding darkness is itself one of the most profound experiences the underground offers. One of the things that makes it qualitatively different from the surface world, in ways that change how you experience being a thinking creature in a world that extends very far beyond what you can currently see. The people who went down the steps with their fire knew this experience well. It was not unknown. It was part of what going underground meant, and part of why the underground was different from anything the surface offered. The small light in the large dark, the visible limited by the illumination you carry, the knowledge that what is in the dark is there whether you can see it or not. Underground, you orient by touch, and by the feel of the stone under your feet, and by the sound the space makes around you, and by the going down way itself. The prepared path that tells you where you are going so that you do not need to see far ahead to trust the next step. The trust required to descend into the dark is a specific kind of trust. Trust in the preparation that was done before you arrived. Trust in the knowledge that made the descent possible. Trust in the tradition that maintained that knowledge across all the long time between one descent and the next. It is the trust that the next step will be there because someone made sure it was there, because the knowledge of where it should be was maintained and kept alive through everything, because the tradition endures through the patience and the care of the people who hold it. That is the gift of the going down way. Not just the physical feature cut into the stone, but the trust that the feature embodies. The trust that says someone knew you would need this and made it for you and kept the knowledge alive across all the time between the making and this moment. The stone holds, the traditions hold, the trust holds. And tonight, you hold it too, lightly, in the dark, as you drift towards sleep. Good night.